Please give me your attention for a few moments as I outline the emergency procedures to be followed at today's event. This building is equipped with a fire alarm system. In the event of an emergency, the alarm will sound. Since there are no planned fire drills for today, if the alarm sounds, it will be treated as a real emergency. Once the alarm has sounded, calmly make your way through one of the exits. These two exits, which are clearly marked, are to the left and the right of the media stage area. Please take a moment to identify the exits nearest to you. Once outside the room, make your way to the muster point, which is located east of the building that abounds the St. Augustine Circular Road. Stay at the muster point and await further instructions. In the event of an earthquake, stay calm, look out for falling debris. Once the shaking stops, exit the building in a calm and orderly manner and assemble at the muster point where you'll receive further instructions. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jessica Byron. I am the director of the Institute of International Relations, and I'll be chairing this session. Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Brian Copeland, Honorable Minister of Trade and Industry, Mrs. Paula Gopi-Skoon, Professor Emeritus Compton-Bourne, our honored guests, the members of the McIntyre family, Ambassador June Suma, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, other ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, PVC Stefan Gift, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies, Entrepreneurship and Innovation, government officials, including Ms. Jennifer Marchand, Acting Deputy Permanent Secretary, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, distinguished participants in this seminar, members of the U.W.I community, ladies and gentlemen, the Institute of International Relations bids you all a very warm welcome. I have a feeling lots of our guests are going to arrive a bit late, given the traffic this morning. We'll welcome them when they come. I hope that your journey here was a smooth one, especially for our many guests who have traveled from overseas. Thank you for making that extra effort. We are so happy to welcome you today, as well as those participants who will join us virtually. We hope you will all find the discussions stimulating and productive. I would like us at this moment to just spend a minute thinking of our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas who are struggling to recover from a traumatic natural disaster, Hurricane Dorian, that has brought deep personal tragedy. So let us pause for just 1 minute to reflect and let our thoughts and prayers and sentiments of sympathy and solidarity flow towards them. And we will continue to support them in the long journey of reconstruction. So a few seconds of silence for the Bahamas, please. I resume my remarks now. Now, it is a special honor for the Institute of International Relations excuse me, to organize a symposium to honor the memory of Sir Alister McIntyre. Our business is the study and the teaching of students who aspire to careers as international functionaries, diplomats, and public officials. For 30 years, I have encouraged such young scholars to read the autobiographies and biographies of people like Sir Alister and Sir Sridhar Ramphal in order to grasp what it really means to be involved in regional affairs, national service, and international affairs at various international junctures. Sir Alister, born in the 1930s in Grenada, was a brilliant economist, technocrat, and diplomat whose life embodied public service to the entire Caribbean and the international community. He was a committed regionalist concerned with finding solutions to the development challenges not only of the Caribbean, but of the global South. Sir Alister made a very significant contribution to building this university during its early years when he was a young lecturer at Mona and St. Augustine. And if you look at pages 63 to 65 of his memoirs, they refer to the Institute of International Relations and his role in crafting the cooperation agreement with the Swiss government, the Trinidad and Tobago government, and the university that brought the Institute of International Relations into being. They also refer to the 3 years that he spent teaching international economic relations here at the Institute. He returned to the U.W.I. in 1988 at a critical juncture, right after the devastation of the Mona campus by Hurricane Gilbert. And he spent 10 years as Vice-Chancellor. During that time, he made significant contributions to the university's internationalization and the stabilization of its finances. This is an ongoing, eternal task. I believe the U.W.I. Endowment Fund was set up under his watch, and I know he gave deep thought to the broader challenge for the entire Caribbean of sustainably financing the tertiary education sector. I want to congratulate my colleagues, Professor of Practice Winston Dukaran and Dr. Dave Siratan, for having conceptualized this symposium, and to Lady McIntyre and her family for their support and their representation here today. Welcome, Arnold and Nicholas. I also want to recognize with deep appreciation the generous financial support received from our sponsors, the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, the Central Bank of Barbados, and yes, the Central Bank of the Bahamas. All members of the Caribbean Monetary Council, also the Research and Development Fund of the Office of Graduate Studies and Research here at St. Augustine. Thank you, Professor Gift. I want to commend and thank the very committed and hardworking members of the organizing committee. Also, the support that we have received from the U.W.I. Inn and Conference Center, Marketing and Communications of the university, the bursary and campus security services. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sure Sir Alister is with us today in spirit. I wish you all a wonderful symposium, and it's now my pleasure to call on Professor Copeland, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, to deliver his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Jessica. To Senator, the Honorable Paula Goopy-Schoon, Minister of Trade and Industry, Mrs. Jennifer Marchand, Acting Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, PVC of Graduate Studies and Research, Professor Stefan Gift, welcome. Professor Jessica Barron, who just welcomed you in her way. Director of the Institute of International Relations. I'd like to give a special welcome to Professor of Practice Winston Dukaran, who spoke to me about this initiative a couple of months ago. Professor Emeritus Compton Bourne, former campus principal, U.W.I St. Augustine. Sons of Sir Alister, Dr. Arnold McIntyre, Deputy Division Chief, International Monetary Fund, and Mr. Nicholas McIntyre, Vice President of Citibank. Distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, deans and heads of the U.W.I St. Augustine campus, staff and students of the U.W.I St. Augustine campus, and specially invited guests, good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Okay. On behalf of the St. Augustine campus, I'm pleased to welcome you to the University of the West Indies. And for our non-residents, a special welcome to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, on April 24th of this year, the Jamaica Observer published a tribute to Sir Alister McIntyre, who passed just 4 days earlier. And it began with these words. On hearing of the passing of Sir Alister McIntyre on Saturday, we were reminded of Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American transcendentalist, poet, and essayist, who once said, "Death comes to us all, but great achievements build a monument which shall endure until the sun grows cold." So Alister's achievements have been many indeed. And in fact, the very growth of a more integrated Caribbean, we haven't reached there yet, was due to his pioneering leadership as CARICOM Secretary General from 1974 to 1977. This life of selfless service was recognized when CARICOM bestowed the Order of the Caribbean Community on him in 1994. The University of the West Indies has also been a beneficiary. His immense contribution to this institution included his service as Vice Chancellor of the Regional University from 1988 to 1998. And indeed, Jessica, he was the one who who started the Development Fund. And in fact, it was in response to the devastation visited by Gilbert on the Mona campus. But during this time, however, he played a major role in directing the university's growth and strategic influence. So I think you'll agree that it is fitting that a symposium of this nature be held in honor and memory of Sir Alister McIntyre, an economist of note, a renowned scholar, an author, and a dedicated integrationalist. It is just as fitting that this university should be the driver for and location of the event. The U.W.I is now midway into its 2017-2022 AAA strategic plan, for which it adopted the mandate, and I'm quoting here, to advance learning, to create knowledge and foster innovation for the positive transformation of the Caribbean and the wider world. I see this symposium as one that contributes in no small way to the U.W.I fulfilling this mandate. The symposium, in fact, has ambitious objectives, but this is in keeping with the modus operandi of Sir Alister, who I'm sure would never have had such an ongoing regional impact if he did not think big and think innovatively to effect solutions. His ideas inspired action. Given the challenges faced by the Caribbean today, I submit that yours can and must do the same. So you are here because you have consciously agreed to devote 2 days of your life at the U.W.I Inn and Conference Center, to break away from the narrow confines of orthodoxy in development thinking to discover new and innovative solutions to our development thinking. And I'm quoting here from Professor Byron's invitation letter to me. And I have to say that the words of an invitation are strongly reflected in the motto of the U.W.I that refers to the institution as a light rising in the West, which, if you think of it, is a built-in exhortation to shift paradigms and rise above orthodoxy to drive our peoples to a more sustainable future. The Jamaica Observer article closes tribute to Sir Alister with these lines, and I quote again, "The Caribbean has lost a great son, but we are all the richer for the time he spent with us," unquote. You can provide no greater tribute than by building on the rich foundation of his body of thought to finally take the Caribbean into new and exciting space that our pioneering forefathers envisioned more than half a century ago. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a very successful event. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Principal. And now it is my pleasure to invite to the podium Senator the Honorable Paula Gopi-Skoon, Minister of Trade and Industry of the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Jessica. Professor Brian Copeland, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations here at St. Augustine. Professor Emeritus Compton Bourne, professors, members of academia, members of the McIntyre family, members of the Symposium Organizing Committee, very distinguished participants and specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And it is a great honor on behalf of the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to deliver an address today at today's opening ceremony on the Symposium, The Caribbean on the Edge, Rising Above the Orthodoxy of Development Thinking. The Institute of International Relations and the wider University of the West Indies, which I understand has been placed among the top 5 in the universities in the world, stand at the forefront in understanding regional integration in the Caribbean and is in itself a shining example of the success of Caribbean regionalism and cooperation. I therefore wish to recognize the Institute's commitment to enhancing our understanding of the Caribbean reality as demonstrated by the hosting of this event. Symposiums such as these are important to facilitate exchanges of ideas and perspectives among academics, policymakers, the private sector, and international organizations so that together possible approaches and solutions to the region's development challenges can be found. And I say all of this in the context of us being relatively young nations. It is fitting from the outset of my remarks to pay tribute to today's honoree and instrumental West Indian regionalist, Alister McIntyre, a highly celebrated intellectual who was considered one of the great socio-economic thinkers of the time. He piloted the movement for integration as Secretary General of CARICOM from 1974 to 1977 and as Vice Chairman of the West Indian Commission. He was a vanguard in the development of economic theory and practice in the region, with his work having inspired generations of students and politicians, academics, and those dedicated to the idea of a viable and vibrant Caribbean. His contribution to the Caribbean is an invaluable one that is both recognized and acclaimed globally, and the region will forever remain indebted to him. In the preamble to the program of this symposium, the question was posed: could the Caribbean stand up to recurring risks ahead and forge a confident pathway for sustainable development? And to that I say a resounding yes. For far too long, people both within and outside the region have somewhat restricted the possibilities of Caribbean economies due to diversities, limitations in terms of land, labor, and economies of scale, and the economic models that were pursued. And these limitations have largely influenced the developmental models of the past and resulted in a belief that the Caribbean and its people are destined to a fate that is determined and dictated by others. And ladies and gentlemen, for us to depart from orthodox development thinking, we must first reflect on our origins and examine some of the initial Caribbean perspectives and approaches which defined the nature of the political economy of the region in the last 50 years or so. And coming to mind are intellectuals such as George Beckford and Carrie Levitt and Lloyd Best, who characterized the Caribbean as a plantation economy. And Sir Arthur Lewis's industrialization by invitation model also influenced and shaped economic policy making in the past. And its tenet of attracting foreign direct investment to develop infant industries is still a widely used economic policy today. Lewis believed industrialization demanded positive and intelligent action by governments. But globalization has positively changed the dynamics of Caribbean economies, and countries of the region are now more integrated into an international economy. So from foundations built on the plantation economy, the Caribbean economy had traditionally relied on one or a few limited export sectors for economic growth and development in the past. However, the region has since advanced, and some of the economies, to some extent, have transformed away from, but not enough, from traditional sectors into the production of higher value-added goods and services that are in demand in many parts of the world. Several of our economies have developed internationally competitive sectors in areas such as energy and tourism, manufacturing. However, there are those, admittedly, that have remained challenged. Today, we understand that development is an all-encompassing concept, marked not only by improving the economic welfare, but improving the standards of living of members of our community. And in that regard, governments see the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a roadmap for emerging economies like ours, and to achieve more than economic development, but sustainable development. And from that standpoint, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has integrated the Sustainable Development Goals in its overarching National Development Plan, which is called the National Development Strategy 2016-2013 Vision 2030. And similarly, in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, we have embraced a more all-encompassing approach to development with the completion of our new Trinidad and Tobago trade policy 2019-2023, and you'd be hearing much more about that. And at its core, the trade policy 2019 to 2023 seeks to shift Trinidad and Tobago away from its dependence on the export of a single product. And according to the policy, it will serve, in fact, this policy will serve as a roadmap to change this reality by increasing the production and export of higher value-added goods and services from industries in which the country has comparative advantages. And to move away from the concentration of a few export markets, the government of Trinidad and Tobago will continue to target the wider Caribbean, as well as South America, Central America, Asian and European economies for export expansion in the first instance. And it is that our analysis has revealed that significant underutilized trade potential exists in markets in CARICOM again, as well as Latin America, the EU, and in Asia, including India, China, and the Asian bloc. And there's also significant potential in the USA as a result of the large Caribbean diaspora that exists in that country. And the government will seek to take advantage of these opportunities. Moreover, the national trade policy introduces for the first time in Trinidad and Tobago issues such as green industries, and I should say in the trade policy, for the first time in a trade policy document, issues such as green industries, which is a new dynamic sector for Trinidad and Tobago, which provides opportunities to develop a green industrial value chain. Developing the green sector will help the country achieve environmentally friendly and sustained growth, as well as jobs. The policy will also address several complementary sector-specific policies and strategies, and some of them also new to our Trinidad and Tobago trade policy. And these sector-specific policies include innovation, global value chains and clustering, gender and the youth, the role of the private sector, use of bilateral agreements, physical and quality infrastructure, investment and export promotion, human capital, trade finance, intellectual property rights, trade and the environment, industrial relations, and e-commerce. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, there are several developments in the international economy which we must be able to exploit to spur a new era of economic growth in the region. And technology is around us, in us, and a part of us. It has moved us from one industrial revolution to another, first using water and steam power, then electric power, and then electronics and information technology to transform our modes and scope of production. Now, with the fourth industrial revolution at hand, which fuses the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds, impacts all disciplines, economies, and industries, and even challenges the idea about what it means to be human. We have no choice but to change. Our new models of development, therefore, must take into consideration the role of technology and the new models of business that are currently transforming everything around us. The government of Trinidad and Tobago recognizes that in abandoning orthodox development thinking, we must acknowledge the instrumental role information and communication technologies play in today's global economy and in achieving our development objectives. Recognizing this, the government is currently implementing the National E-commerce Strategy, which was approved by Cabinet in 2018 and which aims to create and enable an environment that facilitates and promotes e-commerce for local businesses to serve the domestic and international consumer markets. Touching a little bit on one of the subject areas in today's discussions, the political economy of integration and convergence. Global events have led us to take a critical look at our own integration movement and integration agenda. And this analysis must look at regional convergence in the context of the Caribbean's integration into the global economy, as well as its impact on regional industrial structures and the variances in income and development amongst our economies. CARICOM member states are forging ahead with the strengthening of our community, while doing the work of redesigning the structures and processes that underpin it. This will allow for greater convergence and help chart the direction for new integration frontiers. In the context of trade development, the redesign is happening with the review of the Common External Tariff, the CT, the review of the rules of origin, and the restructuring of the oils and fat regime, just to mention a few areas. It is also evident in the work being done across the region to improve the free movement of persons and to upgrade the regulations, the systems, and the procedures which support this free movement. And admittedly, over the last decade, there would have appeared to be some slowing in our community arrangements, or maybe some questioning of our community arrangements. However, as a frequent visitor to the Quartet, and certainly with the commitment expressed by heads more recently, the future for our region is filled with promise, and we continue to work at it for the benefit of the people of the region. One area where our region faces significant threats to our survivability is capital inflows and financing. And skewed distribution of foreign investment among countries, regions, and sectors promote volatility of capital flows and in financing. And while globalization has led to greater mobility of capital, not all countries and not all regions have been equal recipients. The role of capital inflows and access to external financing and international debt markets is part of the development question for Caribbean states. Touching on climate change, the stark reality for the Caribbean and all small island development states, however, is that global issues inevitably become very real local problems. And in the case of climate change, small island development states are disproportionately affected, and the effects can be catastrophic, setting back countries and entire regions, decades of growth and development. And the recent havoc inflicted by Hurricane Dorian to the northern Bahamas islands, Abaco and Grand Bahama, once more underscores the need for a more integrated policy framework and strategy to mitigate the effects of climate change in order to alleviate the economic implications for Caribbean countries. It is also imperative for our countries to adhere to the commitments to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which the Caribbean has been at the forefront in promoting. Ladies and gentlemen, the region does in fact have very good economic potential and growth opportunities. In particular, the Caribbean has an educated, multilingual workforce and sophisticated financial systems, and is a short hop to many of the region's export markets and trading partners in North America and Latin America. The region has great potential to further develop its manufacturing, services, logistics, agriculture, creative, and digital sectors. And as countries, we must therefore remain committed to regionalism as we aim to individually and collectively achieve sustainable development. The evolving global space provides an opportunity to explore and adopt new and practical approaches for Caribbean diplomacy and integration. In a time of rising economic nationalism and protectionist sentiments, Caribbean countries must remain committed to the cause as we progress towards achieving sustainable developments. Perhaps now is a chance to demonstrate to the world that yes, economic integration can not only survive, but thrive. The thematic areas covered in this symposium are not only timely, but they're also critical to development in the region. And these are all areas where regional governments are placing increased emphasis in an attempt to deliver to Caribbean citizens the kind of policies and measures needed for development. And as we contemplate new and unorthodox development thinking, we hope that new and innovative ideas will emerge. And are we to remain on edge, or are we on the edge of a new dawn, the brink of a new order of the day where the Caribbean is ahead of the curve? And I urge you to keep this in mind during the next 2 days of the symposium, and I thank you very much. I apologize that I have to leave because I have a Public Accounts Committee at Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Gopi Skoon, for those cogent comments, which really set the tone for the symposium and made very insightful links between actual development policy and the discussions that will take place over the next 2 days. Thank you very much indeed. And I now invite to the podium Professor Emeritus Compton Bourne, Professor Emeritus and Principal Emeritus from this campus, who has also held many other distinguished positions during his time in the region, particularly in the financial sector. Professor Bourne, welcome.
Professor Brian Copeland, Pro Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal. I think he's disappeared, as the Honorable Minister. Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations, Pro Vice Chancellor Stephen Gift, Distinguished Professor of Practice, Dr. Winston Dukuran, the McIntyre family representatives here, Dr. Arnold McIntyre and Mr. Nicholas McIntyre, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the St. Augustine academic community, and I see representatives of University of the Southern Caribbean and University of Trinidad and Tobago, especially invited guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. I want to begin by thanking Professor Byron for kindly inviting me to speak at this important symposium. I congratulate the entire team of organizers for constructing a well-thought-out program which is sure to enrich our knowledge. The subject of my address to you this morning is the development contribution of Sir Alister McIntyre, a huge topic in view of the prodigious energy, enormous output, regional and international reach, and charming persuasiveness of Sir Alister demonstrated in many forums and bilateral engagements. When I saw the draft program several months ago, I noted that my good friend and colleague of many years, Professor Ramesh Ramsaran, was scheduled to deliver the address. I thought, good choice. Ram is a man known for lifting heavy loads. For reasons beyond his control, the task this morning is now mine. Dr. Siratan seemed to think that Professor Ramsaran and I are interchangeable. Not really. I write briefly, Ramesh writes voluminously. Throughout his professional life, which ended with his demise in April this year, McIntyre operated at the interface between intellectual activity and developmental policy. He worked tirelessly with considerable success in universities, various research and development councils and organizations, and expert working groups in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world. He worked with no less energy, much success, and some exasperation in the policy domains of national governments in the Caribbean, regional organizations, and international organizations. Given the totality of his efforts and the fluidity of his movements between intellectual arenas and policy arenas, and I use the word arenas advisedly, I'm inclined to think of Sir Alister's professional life as a major fungible resource fully committed to Caribbean development from August 1960, when he first joined U.W.I. as a lecturer in economics, through the years of service to the Caribbean in so many different capacities until early 2019. McIntyre's central concern was Caribbean development. The first evidence of this concern can be found in his seminal paper, Aspects of Trade and Development in the Commonwealth Caribbean, written for UN ECLAC in 1965. McIntyre departed from the orthodox characterization of Caribbean countries as being at an intermediate stage of development by first of all, depicting emergent social and economic problems. Secondly, reflecting the contribution of his great friend William Dimas, pointing to the constraints of small size. Third, emphasizing the strategic importance of foreign trade. Fourth, noting the challenges to sustaining exports of the staple commodities. And fifth, identifying the need to develop new leading sectors. His analysis of Caribbean development development problems in his later writings and speeches accommodated subsequent changes in the fabric of Caribbean society, such as the incidence of crime and unemployment, changes in Caribbean governmental and political structures, and changes in the global environment. The McIntyre intellectual approach to development issues was first to identify and elucidate the problems with sufficient clarity and empirical evidence, to appraise extant policies, and then to suggest or recommend practicable policies and solutions. He usually did not leave matters there. He would seek ways of challenging consideration of the issues and recommendations into national, regional, or global policy forums as appropriate. Aspects of Trade and Development reviewed current trade policy of the UK and Canada and pointed to the implications of discernible shifts away from bilateral trade preferences to multilateral arrangements. The paper recommended that Caribbean countries should negotiate a scheme for financial compensation for loss of trade preferences. It advocated multilateral agreements for individual commodities, including provision for compensation funds. McIntyre in the paper then proceeded to deal with Caribbean interregional trade. He noted the small volume and high commodity and country concentration of interregional trade, the minimal cross-border movement of services and credit, and deficiencies in transportation and communications as impediments to intra-regional trade. The paper recommended the adoption of policies for enhanced interregional trade and economic cooperation, including import substitution, an idea subsequently elaborated and advanced in Caribbean economic circles by McIntyre himself and by academic economists and policymakers. Aspects of trade and development had a major impact on Caribbean development policy. It provided the intellectual stimulus for the initial phase of Caribbean economic integration. William Dimas, who in his own writings had been exploring the idea of a customs union for the Caribbean, sent a copy of McIntyre's paper to Dr. Eric Williams, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who was so impressed by its content that he had it circulated to the Caribbean governments and sponsored a working meeting of experts to discuss the ideas. The governments agreed to a U.W.I program of research on integration. These several interconnected activities culminated in the decision by Caribbean heads of government at a meeting in Barbados in October 1967 to establish CARIFTA and the Caribbean Development Bank. The U.W.I program of research on Caribbean integration attracted support from some members of the business community. Its output included the influential Brewster and Thomas study, The Dynamics of West Indian Integration, and studies on agriculture, bauxite, regional air transportation, and shipping. So Alister McIntyre's own direct contribution to Caribbean integration as development policy continued with his companion paper entitled Decolonization and Trade Policy in the West Indies, written also in 1965. He again noted the dismantling of bilateral trade preferences and argued that commodity preferences were not a strong basis for sustained economic development. McIntyre argued that metropolitan trade preferences are not an unmitigated benefits because they, to quote him, have encouraged the economic balkanization of the Caribbean. They have limited opportunities for regional cooperation. They perpetuate divisions among developing countries and possibly impede attention to desirable structural changes. Nonetheless, he counseled retention of existing preferences as long as necessary or possible, while suggesting that countries adopt a multilateral approach to the problems of primary products. His main recommendation, however, is Caribbean economic integration as a development strategy. He recognized that trade creation would be difficult given the different economic circumstances and development strategies of individual countries, and he emphasized the benefits of trade diversion. A later paper entitled The Role of the Economic Integration Process in Regional Development, The Caribbean Experience, written in 1976, while he was Secretary General of CARICOM, outlined 4 dimensions of economic integration, namely unification of markets for goods and services, unification of markets for factors of production, development of complementary structures of production, and harmonization and coordination of economic policies. McIntyre had by then recognized some of the problems affecting the integration movement. He directly refuted the proposition that convergence of the incomes of participating countries should be a criterion for beneficial participation in the integration movement. He saw value in differential phasing of tariff reductions to accommodate differences in adjustment capacity of countries. He concluded that the current development policy based on import substitution had lost traction. He therefore recommended that the Caribbean should transition to an export expansion policy facilitated by the removal of impediments and constraints to production and distribution, and by the creation of a common economic space. I think there would be good reason to believe that this espousal of the dimensions of an economic integration strategy, which was far more encompassing than the strategy embodied in CRIFTA, laid some of the intellectual foundations for the Time for Action report of the West Indian Commission, on which McIntyre was vice chairman, as well as for the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which gave much prominence to the notion, a fuller notion of economic integration. Another highly important facet of McIntyre's development contribution was to shape how the world viewed the Caribbean and how the Caribbean interfaced with the rest of the world. In his memoirs, The Caribbean and the Wider World, he says the following: I had always started out with the proposition that, given the small size of the Caribbean, one should approach the issue of its development within a global context. This was not a concession to notion of dependency, but rather an interest in seeing how very small countries like the Caribbean could navigate within the world to take advantage of external opportunities for development. By the 1990s, McIntyre was certainly viewing small size as a fundamental consideration, but not as an immutable constraint. This perspective led to various forms of engagement with extra-regional development and bilateral donor agencies, such as the European Development Fund, the Canadian Agency for International Development, Canada's IDRC, USAID, Ford Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, and foreign as well as foreign business enterprises. McIntyre's objective was to expand and strengthen human resource capacity, which he regarded as critical for economic transformation and sustainable growth. The perspective also led to the Caribbean regional policy of strategically placing its citizens in influential positions in international institutions and organizations, a policy that now seems to have fallen into disuse. It led as well to attempts within CARICOM to develop common foreign policies or to institute a framework for coordination of foreign policies to assist in managing external influences and to maximize the Caribbean's leverage internationally. Alister McIntyre played a major role in the negotiations between the European Union and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries leading up to Lomé I. As an advisor to CARICOM in March 1972, he authored a paper entitled "Some Economic Issues Arising from the Options Offered by the Enlarged European Community to Developing Countries in Africa, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Caribbean." That's a very long title. The paper was well received as a background document for the negotiations. So Alister McIntyre, by invitation of the African delegation, spoke on behalf of the ACP countries as a whole, countries that were seeking inclusion in a revised Yaoundé Convention. Lomé I was a critical and a very highly important start of a major structured program of European development assistance extending through Lomé II, Lomé III, and Lomé IV until 1999. One should also take note of McIntyre's other activities on the international stage, which had the potential for improving Caribbean development. I make mention, for instance, of the United Nations Common Fund for Commodity. Another facet of his development contribution is pioneering the outreach of Caribbean scholars and governments to Latin America and the Hispanic Caribbean. Advocacy of a policy of reaching out to Latin America was first evident in the Aspects of Trade and Development paper, which recommended strengthening the then minimal economic relations with Latin America. This continued to be a recurrent theme in McIntyre's writings, discourses, and advice on Caribbean trade policy. The West Indian Commission, of which he was vice chairman, presented a strong case for widening the Caribbean community, and this led to the convention establishing the Association of Caribbean States, which was signed in July 1994 in Cartagena, Colombia. As we know, full members of the Association of Caribbean States include Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela. In his epilogue, written this year for publication of his collected papers on trade, integration, and development, edited by me, Andrew Downs, Alan McIntyre, and Rosalie O'Malley, Alister McIntyre urged trade expansion with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. In other words, he continued to address these issues and to make recommendations for a widening of the Caribbean community, especially in its trade relations. In addition to advocacy of outreach, McIntyre leveraged his professional associations and goodwill, which were established in the 1960s and 1970s, to establish gateways for other Caribbean professionals and to get favorable responses to initiatives for funding academic centers and other forms of intra-regional university collaboration. Notable successes include the U.W.I. Mexico Technical Agreement in 1991, the Latin American Center at Mona, and the joint degree programs with universities in the Dominican Republic financed by the European Development Fund. In the epilogue, he had clearly begun to consider carefully the prospects for expanded economic relations with other countries and other regions. He noted the possibilities for expanded trade with a specific region and with Asia created by the widening of the Panama Canal. He noted with approval the developing business and international relations with Africa, but recommends attention as well to East and South Africa. Now, I made reference earlier to the strategic importance of human resource development in Sir Alister's conceptualization of Caribbean development. In this regard, one must see his activities in expanding and improving the quality and relevance of tertiary and university education as important contributions to Caribbean development. With respect to U.W.I, the focus of his initial activities in the 1960s and 1970s was the development of research capacity in the social sciences and the generation and dissemination of research on important areas such as governance and politics, electoral systems, economic integration, demography and labor markets, the role and operations of multilateral corporations, fiscal systems, and monetary and financial systems and policies. As an outstanding example, the Regional Program for Monetary Studies, created by McIntyre's ISER in 1968, served for decades as a major vehicle for professional development and expertise in the leadership of Caribbean central banks. The second phase of his engagement with U.W.I, which lasted from 1988 till 1998, had several main components: stabilization and growth of U.W.I finances, expansion of the physical infrastructure, expanded student enrollment, strengthening of science and technology capacity within the university, establishment and development of institutional collaboration in the rest of the Caribbean, Latin America, the UK, and the USA. Mention could also be made of his contribution to the establishment of the Association of Caribbean Tertiary Institutions. Relevant research remained central to his development strategy. In his words, the problems that might otherwise be imposed by small size could be overcome through judicious investigation and pursuit of opportunities. This led him to the conclusion that a major effort had to be made at the level of research to unearth the most promising opportunities for production and trade and development of appropriate human resources for those endeavors, end of quote. In this regard, the effort to which reference has been made throws out a challenge to the Caribbean to select areas of the global value chain for focused attention and to embrace new developments in technology to add value to the region's products. There is an aspect of McIntyre's development contribution which goes largely unnoticed. It is the situating of Caribbean business enterprises as genuine partners of governments and academia in the pursuit of Caribbean development. Often seen unrealistically as not subscribing to national development goals and objectives, and often feeling themselves relegated to the periphery of decisions taken by governments and universities, the potential role of the business sector in Caribbean development was underappreciated until the 1990s. McIntyre, long before then, had begun to stress positive roles for the business sector in development of regional and international trade policy, in participation in international trade negotiations, in entrepreneurial activities in production and marketing within the regional economic space and globally, and in helping to shape and finance teaching and research programs at the universities in the region. Collaboration between McIntyre and the business community in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and the US led to the introduction of academic programs at U.W.I. and to the establishment of specialized centers for professional business and management education. In recent times, business enterprises have been making substantial financial contribution to various teaching and research programs. The business sector, the Caribbean business sector, is now more visible in preparations for international trade and economic missions by Caribbean governments and in participation in those missions. At the regional level, there is formal inclusion at the Conference of Caribbean Heads of Government and States, but there is still some distance to travel in making this participation meaningful and effective. So progress has been made, but there is not enough. I want to conclude in this address on the development contributions of Sir Alister McIntyre by saying that I have endeavored to provide a short guide to the main areas of the contributions. Some things have been deliberately omitted because of time constraints. For instance, his advisory and technical service to individual governments in Guyana, Jamaica, the OECS, and Trinidad and Tobago, covering a wide range of subjects, some seemingly as mundane as bananas or citrus, is the case of work with Trinidad and Tobago government and Dr. Eric Williams, or major industries as bauxite in Jamaica and Guyana, and of course, fiscal stability and reform in the OECS. Hopefully, however, what I have presented here this morning contributes to your appreciation of one of the foremost figures in the post-independence development of the Caribbean. I thank you for the kind courtesy of your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Compton-Bourne, for taking us through a very long journey of Sir Alister's development contributions and managing to do it in 25 minutes. Thank you very much. There is something, ladies and gentlemen, that is not written on your programs. We have a special presentation to make to the McIntyre family. This will be done by the principal, and so I would now like to invite Principal Copeland, Dr. Arnold McIntyre, and Mr. Nicholas McIntyre to the podium. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I just want to mention that the sculpture represents unity. Sir Alister was a dedicated believer in Caribbean regionalism and worked very hard for Caribbean unity. And the little sculpture is a small symbolic token of that kind of unity that he spent so many years working for. This brings us to the end of the opening session of this symposium. I would like to invite all the presenters and chairs and so on for a picture taking, a photography session. The photographers will give you instructions. But I would like to also invite everybody to coffee. There's a coffee break, and the reception area concerns those tables with white tablecloths behind. So please avail yourselves of the refreshments and feel free to be comfortable at the tables behind. We'll be reconvening, I think, Dave, how much time is the break? I have to confer with the chief organizer. Sorry? 20 minutes. 20 minutes break for coffee, and a little less time for those of you who have to be involved in the official photograph. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Stefan Gift. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies and Research at U.W.I, and I'm really pleased this morning to be part of this very important symposium. Professor Byron, I thank you for inviting me, and let me welcome again all of you to this session. Quoting from the document, the sub-theme, Development Thought, Economic Policy, Directions, and the Practice of Development is the sub-theme. And it says here, this session will provide the opening discourse for the symposium. It will explore the underpinnings of economic thought that informed development thinking, provide pathways to rescue the future, identify theoretical and policy insights for influencing new directions for Caribbean development, and provide insights into the practice of development that will work in a Caribbean setting. So with those words, I want to welcome our first presenter. He is Dr. Arnold McIntyre, and if I might just introduce him appropriately. Dr. McIntyre is a Grenadian national, is Deputy Division Chief, Western Hemisphere Department in the IMF. Prior to his current assignment, Dr. McIntyre was the Center Coordinator of the IMF Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center, CARTAC. Dr. McIntyre received a BSc in Economics honors degree from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados, and an MSc in Economics from U.W.I again, St. Augustine. An MA in Economics at Yale University was awarded, and a PhD in Economics from the University of Toronto. Prior to joining the Western Hemisphere Department, Dr. McIntyre worked for several years in the African Department, including serving as the fund's resident representative in Ghana for 3 years. So this morning, he will be presenting on the Caribbean Challenge, Strengthening Growth and Resilience. May I invite Dr. McIntyre, please?
Good morning, just making sure I understood the technology. Let me thank, first of all, let me extend on behalf of my brother Nicholas and myself and the entire family, Let me first of all extend our deepest appreciations to the university, to the institute and its leadership for the recognition of our father. Dr. Jessica Byron, Dr. Brian Copeland, all distinguished members of the university, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can dispense with formalities. It is indeed an honor to participate in this symposium at this time, and I was expressing to Professor Winston Buchanan that the appropriateness of the title of the symposium, The Caribbean on the Edge. Sitting as I do in Washington, excuse me, and having ready information on global economic affairs, the world is on an edge. And we are going through a period of transformation in the global economy that is likely to be with us for at least another 10 years. We can discuss more about that aspect for those interested. But the Caribbean itself is now caught in that. Let me share a few general thoughts. Post the global crisis in 2007, a lot of the public discourse on the Caribbean economy has expressed disappointment at economic performance in many countries and highlighted the economic challenges that countries are facing. Against this background, it can be easy to slip into a mood of pessimism. The evidence indicates that the Caribbean has been slowest in its recovery from the crisis in the Western Hemisphere. So there is cause for concern. But let me say at the outset, the Caribbean must not lose its confidence, must not become fatalistic in accepting a less than prosperous future. Rather, we need to summon our confidence, instill greater discipline in the management of our economic affairs, and achieve greater inclusion in policy design and implementation. This is a moment in time, colleagues, where forward-looking decision-making, while not necessarily bringing immediate development reward, is needed, and most importantly, we must stay the course. Hence the choice of my topic: how do we achieve stronger, sustainable growth while rebuilding resilience to minimize the negative impact of climate change and natural disasters and other global events over which we have no control? What does the evidence say? I feel very much like a university. What does the evidence say? Well, the evidence points to the fact that the development indicators would suggest that the Caribbean has done quite well over the last number of years. In GDP per capita, life expectancy, infant mortality, female labor participation, voice and accountability, the Caribbean has made significant strides. When we look more closely, since in the 2000s, we recognize that the early strides are in some senses reversing themselves. We see that Caribbean tourism-intensive economies, I don't know if I have a pointer here. Yes, Caribbean tourism-intensive economies. The performance of Caribbean tourism-intensive economies. This 25% is the upper quintile of emerging market, what we call emerging market countries. They are outside of that. The growth performance of tourism-intensive economies has been very disappointing. Natural resource-based economies, less so. When we look at real GDP growth, Caribbean commodity exporting economies look downward. Caribbean damaged by the global crisis, some improvement, but coming from a very low base. Look at the rest of the world. On any vary of metrics, our growth performance is disappointing. Let us ask the question, why are we observing that? I would posit that there are two broad set of factors, some structural, some macroeconomic, that are reinforcing each other. On the structural side, you have small open economies that are subject to climate and other shocks, so income volatility is an aspect of economic performance. We have low financial deepening and inclusion. There's a lack of diversification. There is now a high incidence of violent crime, and we'll talk a bit about that. It is impacting growth prospects in some of these countries. And I want to point particularly to this issue, the skill gaps and infrastructure gaps that are emerging that are structural impediments to growth. an undiversified energy mix that is making energy costs very high, the high cost of doing business, lots of economic regulations, bureaucratic red tape, inefficiency, transactions costs are very high, that is impeding the efficiency of the private sector. And of course, the two shocks we have faced, loss of preferential access and deficient assistance. On the macroeconomic side, we have limited policy space because we have very weak fiscal positions, we have elevated levels of public debt, and on the supply side, we have limited labor flexibility. In the financial sector, we have high non-performing loan levels, which brings into questions financial sector stability. We have other financial shocks that we are facing now, like potential loss of corresponding banking relationships, the challenge of anti-money laundering, and then we have the issue of the loss of cost competitiveness. That's the broad picture. When we look at the fiscal side, what do we see? We have high public debt levels and limited fiscal space is a key vulnerability. If we look at government fiscal deficits, we see in 2010 and then 2018. Look at Trinidad and Tobago or Belize in 2010 where they were, but other countries, Suriname, Guyana, Antigua, Bahamas, and in the outstream you have Barbados. Everywhere, well in 2018, everywhere you see fiscal deterioration. Look at central government gross debt, 2010, 2018, projections to 2024. Very elevated levels of government debt, particularly St. Kitts, Jamaica, and Barbados. What do we see? Fiscal positions in the region have been highly vulnerable to shocks. When we look at our debt decomposition over here, one second. When you look at our debt decomposition, tourism intensive, 2006 to 2011, what do we see? Interest is a large part of explaining our debt in this period. That means that before the global crisis, we already had very significantly elevated debt levels in many of the tourism-intensive countries. What happened, but at the same time, in that period, what was the fiscal balance? We see that in fiscal balance, we see that primary spending was very high, driving deteriorating fiscal positions, and this was accommodated by expansionary fiscal policy and high levels of debt accumulation. In the commodity exporters, you have a different picture. In the commodity exporters between 2006 and 11, you have the benefit of strong rates of growth, then you have the benefit of strong rates of growth, and then you have the benefit of better fiscal performance. But the commodity exporters' fortunes changed markedly after 2011, pretty much in movement with the commodity cycle. For the tourism-intensive economies, post the global cycle, debt to GDP of the region went up by 9.3% of GDP. That was the cost in debt terms of the global financial crisis and slowdown. After the global crisis, 2011 to 2016, what do we see? We see that growth improved from very negative numbers to somewhat positive numbers, and this tended to improve the overall debt to situation, debt being measured by debt to GDP ratios. And we see that real interest rates, because of lower debt, interest spending came down, and that also helped the debt situation. Not that these countries' debt levels were not elevated, but the trajectory of debt accumulation flattened. Rather than being like that, it came down like that. When we look at the commodity exporters, what do we see? We see that primary deficits exploded in this period here. And when we go to the fiscal side, we realize that a lot of that was due to the fact that revenues coming from the commodity sector declined quite substantially. In this period, the debt to GDP ratio of the commodity exporters in the Caribbean went up by 20% of GDP. A lot of it coming from Trinidad and Tobago. So what we have, we put that picture together, what we have with what we said before, and an issue I'll come to, is that the region is caught in a vicious cycle of low growth and high debt. And that's our principal challenge. But it's not our only challenge, because at the same time we are facing this, we have exposures to natural disasters that add to the low growth, high debt nexus. If you look here, you will see that compared to the other countries in the world, the Caribbean states are among the top 25 most disaster vulnerable countries. The frequency of natural disasters in Caribbean small states outperforms the Pacific small states and other small states. So we have a higher degree of natural disaster than any other small countries in the world. Then if you look over here, the damage, the percent of GDP damage, again, Caribbean states outperform other states. So at a time when we are facing prolonged periods of low growth and high debt, we are also experiencing substantial shocks from natural disasters that are having very significant economic impacts. But also we observe that not only are these disasters having significant impact, their risks are more acute. The average annual effects of natural disasters, damage as a percent of GDP, when you look at it, other states is this. Small states, in the Caribbean, it is 6 times. Every metric shows you that the average annual disasters per 1,000 kilometers, the Caribbean is up there. 324 of 511 disasters that was hit small states in 1950 to 2016 were in the Caribbean. Disasters are more frequent, they're more costly, and the strength of the storms has elevated. You would notice that we've had 4 Category 5 storms in the last 3.5 years, whereas the previous 20 years we had 2. Climate change, the intensity and impact of climate change is strengthening. In addition to that, when we look at our energy mix, you realize that the Caribbean is one of the most petroleum or fuel-dependent regions of the world. 87% of our energy is provided by fossil fuels. The world is here, we are here. And in all studies, we look at the cost of doing business. The cost of electricity supply is highlighted as a major impact on the cost of doing business, which goes to our cost competitiveness. When we look in the financial sector, what do we see? Non-performing loans, 2007 and 2018. And then we have a dot to what is the peak value for that period. If we look at St. Kitts and Nevis, 25% of total loans are non-performing. If we look at St. Lucia, you would see the peak here. Some countries have come down from their peak, but most countries in 2018 are considerably higher than they were in 2007. So the asset quality of the banking system is an issue. When we then go across and say on the supply side, all of the major studies that are done, surveys of small and medium-sized enterprises, we surveyed that in the fund across the number of these surveys in the World Bank. We find that access to credit is a significant issue. The Latin American and Caribbean average is here in terms of people responding that this is an issue, but you see that a number of Caribbean countries are higher than the average for the hemisphere. Where are the non-performing loans? The non-performing loans are concentrated in construction and tourism. Tourism now is a significant sector for a large part of the Caribbean. So that is a concern. Then we come now and we say the Caribbean has very migrant societies. People talk often, about the benefits of remittances and so on. There's no question that remittances in many of these islands, including in Jamaica, are a very important source of foreign exchange inflow. But what about the growth impact of the outward migration? When you look here, when you look here at the percent of the population in 2050 of migrants, look at the percent of Dominica had the storm, but look at that. And look at the average. Everybody has a substantial amount of migration. The Inter-American Development Bank did a study which we assisted with. 76% of the individuals graduating from tertiary institution in the Caribbean in the last 25 years have migrated. So you have essentially exported 76% of your human capital. The endowment left for development is about 25% of your human capital base. You cannot grow with that kind of endowment. When we look at the brain drain, you see skilled persons, immigration, the Caribbean is right on top compared to all other small countries in the world. When you go on, you look at the United States, one of the most important markets or countries for migration. Caribbean migrants coming into the United States, their average salary upon entering the United States is $38,000 a year. The average salary of a Latin American or South American migrant is $19,000 a year. Our people are coming in with skills and are working in skilled positions. And if you see that all the studies on globalization point to the fact that skilled labor is reaping the largest reward of integrated markets, and you link that with the aging populations in advanced economies, this trend of the migration of skills is going to intensify. In short, our young people are not seeing economic opportunity. Why would they? We have a growth malaise going on. We talk about crime, but I'm conscious of time. I don't want to hog it. But we can come back to that because we've done a lot of work on this. When we look now at putting this together, and we go across all of these surveys, and we rank the Caribbean relative to a series of developing countries, including small states, we find that when you have red, it means that your ranking is considerably worse than your comparators. And we see for immigration, skilled immigration, natural disasters, government debt, etc., the Caribbean is significantly worse than its comparators. And these are some of our principal structural impediments to growth. And then we also say that the Caribbean is a high-cost destination for doing business. I argue that both of these things are very related. How do we break the vicious cycle? What we did was to say, those policy areas we just discussed there, immigration, skills, etc., etc., we did a simulation to say, look, if the Caribbean was to improve its performance relative to its peers, to be in the top 25% of its peers, what is the growth impact? And we find that the growth impact is that the Caribbean would get growth gains of 1 to 3% of GDP per year. And these would be the benefits. Lower NPLs, these are the growth impact, and it varies between countries. Some countries, for example, in St. Lucia, lowering the NPLs is a big thing. Some countries, everywhere the greater ease of doing business is important. Suriname, particularly important. Guyana, particularly important. Trinidad, important, but not as important, but the Trinidadians may argue with me about that. But in every case, the simulations point to the fact that the growth dividend from tackling the structural impediments would be large. The region has grown slower than other small states, slower than other emerging markets, and slower than the world economy for 25 years. That is a long, long time. And what this shows, if we tackle these impediments over the long term, there's no immediate reward. These things take time. That's why sustaining the efforts is important. If we do that, we will elevate our growth trajectory to the top 25% of small states, Mauritius, Malta, places like that. Let me quickly move through. The fiscal adjustment required is substantial across countries. And I can discuss this chart in more detail. The structure of expenditure that we have has to be transformed. People point all the time to the wage bill, but a big problem is a lot of the government's business is done off budget. So a lot of the transfers that are made to these state enterprises are not recorded on budget. In every program the fund has done in the Caribbean in the last 10 years, we've had to spend considerable time taking expenditures off budget onto budget. Had to do it at Air Jamaica, had to do it with a lot of things in Barbados and so on. And when you do that, the overall government primary balance is substantial. The wage bill in these countries averages between 8 to 10% of GDP, except in St. Kitts where it's 14% of GDP. But the public sector wage bill, where we have numbers, is 26% of GDP. A quarter of the GDP is going to pay employees in state enterprises. The size of the state is too large, it is too costly, and it is too inefficient. That is where the immediate policy challenge has to be. And we have to be able to sustain fiscal discipline. Our fiscal discipline goes in ebbs and flows. We are now I'm now doing some work with another colleague of mine looking at this, and we can talk a bit about more, and I can give you more views on that. Then we have to now deal with natural disasters and climate change as an ongoing reality. We cannot be going to the world every 2-3 years with a storm and say, help me pay for the storm. We know we get storms. This is not a surprise. We have to start having fiscal savings so that we can take more responsibility for the immediate aftermath of storms. We can increase the amount of insurance that we provide and also assist households to have greater insurance. This is going to be a statutory expenditure item as we do for education and health. Removing the non-performing loans is a big issue as well, and that can have benefits. Diversify the energy matrix. I mean, if you see what Jamaica has done, in 2015, 94% of Jamaica's energy matrix came from fossil fuels or diesel oil. 2016, 62. The projection for 2019, they have brought it down to 36%. Movement to renewables, wind, solar, and natural gas is changing the generation matrix in Jamaica. The regulatory arrangements have opened up the power purchase agreements such that there's you can sell to the grid, there's net metering, and so on. Similar reforms are required in other countries. I must say, I work on Guyana, and I must say, in Guyana, there is even there, with the onset of large amounts of oil production, they're even still pursuing renewable energy options. Deeper regional integration, we have a study coming out in the next 3 or 4 months on regional integration in the Caribbean, and we make the point very clearly. Deeper regional integration in the region is an absolute necessity. One of the things that goes unnoticed, maybe by some, is that sentiment is very important and confidence in economic outcomes. The region needs a stronger growth performance and a more efficient set of economic arrangements and administrative arrangements for the world to see it as a potential source of investment. If one country is doing, we are too small for persons or investors or international economic agents to see a particular country. We may go to Guyana because they have a resource, but in terms of seeing a hospitable environment, you don't see that. This is very, very much a big part of what is going on in Asia, where people see the use of information technology, the lower transactions cost of doing business. You can set up a business in Singapore in 24 hours on your iPhone. You can do that. You can do it in Malaysia in 72 hours on your iPhone. Everything is going to the information technology. Our public bureaucracy is still paper-based. It is still very inefficient, and decision-making takes too long. Crime, and I have some new issues on corresponding banking relationships and so on. So I want to stop here, but I want to point out and to emphasize the absolute importance of a structural reform effort to go along with the effort at fiscal and macroeconomic stabilization. And you would notice in my presentation, I haven't said a thing about exchange rates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntyre. You've given some statistics there that are rather startling, I dare say, and certainly a lot of food for thought for colleagues here at the University of the West Indies to tackle some of these issues. So, Jessica, you know what you have to do, right? Yeah. So, with that, I want to move right along to introduce our next speaker, Professor Winston Dukaran. His topic is Theory Talks, Current Models of Economic Growth Adequate for Caribbean Development. Professor Dukaran is Professor of Practice at the Institute of International Relations at U.W.I. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science, London University, and was a visiting scholar at the Center for International Affairs, Harvard University, USA. He was recently adjunct professor at the University of Toronto and served at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in Washington. He held several political offices in Trinidad and Tobago and is the author of several books, including Crisis and Promise in the Caribbean, Politics and Convergence, Power, Politics and Performance, A Partnership Approach to Development. I want to also add, ladies and gentlemen, that I've had the pleasure and honor of working with Professor Dukaran on some matters of making U.W.I more entrepreneurial. He sits with me on a committee and has been giving me much of his very, very wise counsel, gleaned over many years of working in the Caribbean space. And I take great pleasure in inviting him here this morning to speak, and we welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Giff, for your kind introduction. Our colleague Arnold gave us a comprehensive picture of where we are and where we ought to go. And I thank you very much for putting all that together in this short space of time. I know his paper will be in great demand. And during the course of today and tomorrow, I hope that we will get many new insights into how to fix it. Really, this is what we are about. I want to, in this presentation of mine, to go back on the first principles. And the first principles really lies with the theory behind our growth process, what it is and what it could be. And that is why I refer to the title of my paper as Theory Talks. For in designing how to fix it, we need to go back to the theory that may have informed us to bring us to where we are. And there's no better place to do it than to go back to the well-known Caribbean economist, Arthur Lewis, in his concept of the theory of growth. Arthur Lewis said very, very clearly, my interest was in the fundamental forces determining the rate of economic growth. And in his voluminous writing, which brought him great credit and brought the Caribbean great honor, he designed what is called the basic model of development. And in so doing, he said, development is defined as a problem focusing on the change in the basic rules of operation of an economic system. The two operative words in these definitions was one, growth was the result of the forces at work, and development was the outcome of the rules of operation of the economic system. So I go back to those two issues. This has been done in the context of the general theory of economic growth from time immemorial. For those of us in the field of economics, we were schooled in the school of the physiocrats, who at that time argued that agriculture was the driver of growth. Then came the mercantilists, who said an export surplus was the driver of growth. Then the classicists, who argued that free markets were the driver of growth. And the Marxists, who focus on capital as the driver of growth. And the neoclassical as the entrepreneurship as the driver of growth. Then the Fabian school, identify government as the driver of growth. And Stalinists identify industrialization as the driver of growth. And then in more recent times, the Chicago School identify what Arthur Lewis called schooling as the driver of growth. Indeed, if we look at our own history, we will see that we have walked through that path, taken bits and pieces of all the different schools. Arthur Lewis concluded in his treatise, there is one growth theory, but a set of complementary theories, including a theory of government, where the government should appear to be as much the problem as the solution. Deep thoughts that led us now to look at how do we move towards the trajectory for the future. Economic ideas of that period and of our period implicitly assumed what is referred to as a linear trajectory. From the early days of Harrod models of 1939, to the DOMA models of 1946, to the Kuznets models of 1955, to the Rostow's models of 1960, to the Leontief models of 1986. Arthur Lewis' thinking about the theory of growth and development was located in that framework. How do I apply all that to the Caribbean? So I'll very briefly talk about the analytics of the Caribbean economy and identify only three fundamental analytical concepts. We have heard a lot about vulnerability, and I would not, of course, go into that treatise here today, only to identify in the context of growth that vulnerability is but a structural variable. And by defining it as such, it means that there are certain processes in the system of how the economic system works that we must address. Then we have heard a lot about fragility. And I define fragility as a process variable, focusing largely on institutions and behavior. And finally, the most elusive variable, the variable of resilience, which I define as a strategy and policy variables. It is that combination of analytics upon which the theory of growth must now attempt to find a path and a way forward. The cutting edge of today, therefore, is not so much in the linearity of the process of growth, but in what has been referred to as the thinkers in complexity in a one-world information space. And this is the point of departure in which we are now. How do we therefore reframe Caribbean development in the context of this global situation today? The first issue has to do with the challenges of what has been called globalization. Has globalization taken a wrong turn? Or are we really in the next chapter? It's an important question to ask. And many have felt one way or the other. A wrong turn in the sense that it is being attacked from various sources, and perhaps globalization is in retreat. and all the benefits and the premises upon which we have built our economic strategy was based on a set of premises in globalization which is now in retreat. And I won't go into details here. Or is it really that globalization has taken a new chapter? It is not in retreat. And what we should be discussing is the next chapter of globalization. And that's the first thought in terms of dividing the theory. What are some of the issues of the next chapter? It was mentioned today by several speakers, including Compton-born or professor, in a wonderful treatise on the works of Alister McIntyre, and including the minister in her presentation of the Development Trust, when they talked about the value chain. In the next chapter, the value chain, the global value chain that is, would have grown to become less trade intensive. Not as much trade intensive as in the past period. Services will play a growing and undervalued role in the global value chain. Trade that is based on labor cost arbitrage is declining in some value chains. Global value chains are growing more knowledge intensive. And value chains, as a result of all that I've said today, in terms of the global production function, is becoming more regional and less global. And these ideas came out of a study that was done by McKinsey in the McKinsey Global Institute. So what we are seeing really is changes in the production function. And therefore, on the debate of globalization, perhaps it is not quite correct to say that it is taking a wrong turn. It is perhaps more correct to say that we are entering a new chapter in globalization. The premises of the old chapter will be different to the premises of the new chapter. In that whole process has emerged the new nexus between inequality and economic growth. Inequality, largely manifested itself in the political equation, has re-emerged as a political flashpoint, as an indicator of public discontent. And therefore, the relationship between inequality and economic growth, earlier defined by what has been called the Kuznets early thesis about that trade-off, which has been advocated very strongly by the Eclat school of thought on the issue of equality being the center of development rather than the product of development, has gained a lot of credence. And therefore, in looking at that nexus, we need to therefore try and find the missing link in the theoretical framework between inequality and growth. No longer can inequality be seen as a product of development, but must be seen as a center of development, whether it is driven by state action or by market intervention or by other action will be the issues that we will have to address. The third issue concerning these basics is fixing the global balance of payment imbalances. This is a current issue. At the heart of the debate on trade, global trade, at the heart of the debate of the controversy between the United States and China lies the issue of the global balance of payments. And that global balance of payments has to be, in the eyes of many, corrected. But corrected in whose interests and on how, on what measures. And that lies the whole new dimension of what has been referred to as the global war, as the trade war. Some IMF writers have argued that devaluation as an instrument or tariff reduction as a measure to correct the balance of payments will not work, as apparently that is what has informed the current global thinking, both in terms of the trade war, but fundamentally the global balance of payments issue. And therefore the imbalances there needs to be corrected. And how will small countries be so affected? So the IMF argues that neither devaluation nor tariff competition will work, but what will it work, they said. They have resorted to traditional policy advice, like reduce budget deficits without sacrificing growth. It's almost a contradiction, in my view, to argue that you must reduce budget deficits without sacrificing growth, especially in small countries when growth is dependent on budget deficits. They have argued strengthening competitiveness of the export industries without devaluation or tariff barriers. When in small countries, it's almost as if competitiveness depends on the exchange rate and indeed on other factors. They have argued improved investment in the workforce. These are good structural issues. And encourage lifelong savings, also necessary. But investment does not happen as an exogenous factor. It happens as a result of endogenous factors working together. So it is in this context, therefore, that we begin to look at how do we link how do I link theory to practice? The assumption, therefore, of linearity in economic development pathway is now being questioned. And that's the fundamental issue in the paper that I am presenting to you a summary of. Linearity in economic pathway is now being questioned. The linear model is increasingly being challenged by the very context within which it operates, and that a deeper change of the operating system of the economy is necessary. Recollect, I said earlier on that Arthur Lewis talked about the operating system as the main factor in fostering development. Resource efficiency is now the core driver, and structural waste are at the center of what has been described as a circular economy strategy for development. A whole new literature has developed on that. The implications of that we can talk more about. And the second issue, apart from this issue of the circular economy, is the issue of convergence. There was some reference earlier today, and I think the minister herself spoke about the new frontiers of integration. Real, nominal, or structural convergence at the center of technical change in the catching up process in a one growth theory. Now, as we move from survival to sustainability, convergence has taken on a deeper significance. The economic logic of convergence is not just about enlargement of markets and trade. It is also about value creation and new economic space that is internally resilient, globally competitive, and able to capture future opportunities. The institutions to so do is a subject by itself. And in the context of the Caribbean region, and I think tomorrow we will be discussing to some extent the institutional aspects of integration, we will find that the institutions of so do are perhaps in need of review as well. When the Association of Caribbean States was in fact announced some many years ago, it was seen as a framework institution that will embrace the new convergence concept. So I conclude in terms of theory talks, because I believe what comes out in the performance of economies is always linked back to the theoretical framework upon which the policy prescriptions have been determined. And if the policy prescriptions have been determined on the concept of a linear growth process, what we need now is to look at what I refer to, or what is referred to in the literature as a non-linear logic, embracing the notions of circular economy, convergent spaces, and the dynamics of the value chain production structure. These are fundamental changes in the economic theory that is required. The geometry must search for a synthesis in the logic of theory and the practice of development. And this, indeed, is a huge challenge to Caribbean scholarship in its quest for a new model of growth in Caribbean economy. It is in this context theory talks, and it's in this context revisiting the theory of growth and development in the Caribbean is an absolute requirement today and for the next generation of scholars in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dukaran, for that very interesting presentation. I think Professor Dukaran has started to apply the theory to some of the issues that have been identified and suggesting that changes in the models that we are currently being used may be necessary if we are to bear fruit in our quest to solve these problems. Very interesting. The third presenter listed, I see here that it's supposed to be by Zoom. I don't know if he's on. I'm not sure. It is Mr. Dylan Allen. Is he, or should we go on to Mr. Gantu?
I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. Are you hearing me?
Oh, yes, yes, we are. So, Mr. Dylan Allen, let me just introduce you. We are now seeing
I'm not
and hearing
hearing.
you. You're not hearing me. Okay. Are you hearing me now, Mr. Allen?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Right. So let me introduce you to the audience. Mr. Dylan Allen is the Deputy Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, sub-regional headquarters for the Caribbean based in Port of Spain. Before joining ECLAC, he was a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, where he taught public finance and graduate econometrics. He has published widely, and his current research interests are in public finance, including fiscal reforms, leveraging the diaspora for Caribbean development, and global finance issues affecting Caribbean, small island developing states. His topic is emerging policy directions for the region's development. How are they different and relevant? So, Mr. Allen, over to you, sir. We're hearing you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm pleased to participate in this symposium in honor of Sir Alister, a Caribbean scholar who has made a valid contribution to institution building in the region. I did meet him both as a grad student and later as a lecturer in the Department of Economics. My topic, emerging policy directions for the region's development, how are they different and relevant, allows me some liberties. And I shall seize the opportunity to reflect on the various policy directions and suggest also some policy missteps. Since the period of the 80s, characterized by intense structural adjustment, namely privatization and liberalization, there's been a retreat from the so-called Washington consensus approach to stabilization and growth. The decade in Latin America in the 80s and the less than stellar performance elsewhere over that period has given way to a more balanced approach to development. I would argue that the IFIs, although very present in the region, have been less hawkish about the state and market dichotomy. And this has opened some space for heterodox views and approaches. And I think added to that, the global crisis of 2008, 2009 dealt a decisive blow for those who would roll back the state and denounce regulation as unnecessary. But I take McIntyre's point that you could have inefficiency in the state, but that's a different question from the important role of the state. Those must not be confused. This has also opened the space for those who will proffer or offer a new revised industrial policy aimed at identifying priorities for development. And I'll come back to this at the end. At the national level, ideological divisions have given way to pragmatism, and the evidence is allowed to speak at least a little more clearly in decision-making. This is progress of a kind. Perhaps the most significant change in perspective has been the recognition of the vulnerability of small states and their need to build resilience in all areas. No more do we think of small states as a mere microcosm of large states. I think that perspective has been decisively changed. They're not a smaller version of large economies. In fact, the IMF has recognized the need for resilience building as part of the development discourse. But I think it is hard to find in its actual policy framework much of this perspective, which is very deep in its technical work. I think this issue of resilience is manifest in the way in which governments have related to the SDGs, and where the old notion of growth, as the youngsters would say, is old school. And we find that both Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have sought to develop contingency funds as fiscal buffers to address unanticipated shocks from disasters. The point McIntyre made this morning, that governments have actually been trying to do that. Of course, given the fiscal challenge, how much do you expect to go in these funds? And I would add to that, that the introduction of a hurricane clause in the Grenada debt restructuring framework also is some progress. And the recognition that state contingent instruments are going to be critical in borrowing arrangement going forward. These are new ideas that have come on the table. And I would argue that the new narrative in the discussion of development is now sustainable development rather than growth. What I aim to do this morning is to identify a few areas, a few challenges, and to see what has been the policy response to them, either from the point of view of the domestic policymakers or the IFIs on other partners in development. And these areas are economic growth, export capacity, unemployment, debt accumulation, and the challenge of natural disasters. Having regard to what has gone before, I will only touch on these. It has already been clear to us from the discussion so far that since the global crisis of 2008-2009, the Caribbean economies have not returned to pre-crisis growth, and a few have been in recession. And of course, we know that the commodity producers have suffered as a result of the exhaustion of the commodity business cycle. And the service producers have done a little better, given the expansion, especially of the United States. But the point is that overall growth has not returned to pre-crisis levels. And ECLAC, in its work on structural change, does demonstrate that the Caribbean tend to be slower in its response to recession than other regions, and it links that to investment. If we compare the growth rates of the Caribbean versus other SIDS, you notice that post-2010, other SIDS have done much better. So the Caribbean really, even in relation to its comparators, have not done very well. Let's move to the export capacity. As you know, exports are the lifeblood of the region. This gives us foreign exchange and all the inputs that we need for production, including consumer imports. You look at a graph of export share to GDP, and you notice, especially after 2007, there's been a dramatic decline in export capacity. We also noticed that tourism as a share of GDP has also fallen since 1995, precipitously. It turned up a little after 2013, but the point is, it's on a downward trajectory. In those circumstances, it's not surprising that growth will stall. By the way, it is also important to note that this has also given rise to foreign exchange difficulties in a number of countries. That is something which one has to consider and, of course, come to those challenges. Now, low growth and declining export capacity gives rise to high levels of unemployment, not surprisingly. And the regional unemployment rates, although they have tended to move up a little since the global crisis, is still extremely high. But more importantly, unemployment rates for young people is extremely high, in some places as much as 55%. This is a serious problem. And the fact that young people are migrating is not surprising. But I'll come back to this issue of emigration because I think it's not fully understood. So we have high rates of unemployment. If you disaggregate the unemployment rates by gender, you find that women have higher levels of unemployment on average than males, although women have on average higher levels of education. And this is something that we have to consider very carefully. We also notice the decline in labor productivity for those countries for which we have data. This is an area where notoriously we don't have data. As you know, ECLAC is very passionate about this issue of data. I don't have time to talk about it here, but many indicators can't be properly assessed because there are data gaps, both in terms of the frequency and in terms of the timeliness of the production of data. The challenges mentioned are taking place in the context of high debt, which has been alluded to before. Not only high debt, but also high debt repayment costs, high interest costs. And of course, this has had a negative effect on growth. The standard response to this is the reduction in public spending. But I want to say that the reduction in public spending has not been done within the context of public expenditure reviews, which means that you need a mechanism to determine what aspects of public expenditure are still important and what aspects of public expenditure could be abandoned. And also, I would say that the repression in public spending has largely been occurring on the capital budget side, and that has implications for long-term growth. And I would argue that while some countries have pursued fiscal rules, those fiscal rules only make sense within the context of the business cycle and within the context of allowing for continuous shocks. But those are issues which we could take up later. I think the last issue I want to talk about with respect to the challenges is the issue of environmental vulnerability. This will remain with us for a long time, and this is what we have to confront. It has already been pointed out that of all SIDS regions, the Caribbean is most vulnerable to disasters. The Caribbean loses $3 billion per year because of these storms, and has experienced more disasters and more costly disasters than every other SIDS region, and this is an empirical fact. Of course, 70% of the population live on the in urban centers and located in the coast, and so this is a real problem when it comes to climate change and natural disasters. I think that this issue of responding to natural disasters can't be an issue only of insurance. It has to be a larger issue of how do we raise long-term, low-cost financing to address building back better and responding to climate change. So there are issues that can't be dealt with. And I think Mr. Dukaran related to this in his discussion of the global is, you can't talk of some of these issues only in terms of national or regional terms. These are global issues and in which the Caribbean is caught. So you have to talk about the global implications and the national implications. We will never be able to raise enough insurance to address a decimation of a whole country. These are serious issues. And to talk about insurance, you know, is trivializing serious matters. So what has been the policy focus in respect of these challenges? The World Bank and the IMF in their various roles have sought to address these challenges. And I argue that the response has been fairly orthodox. CARTAC, of course, has been very much involved in looking at fiscal structures, and the IMF programs have largely been on reducing spending and raising taxes, all of this in the context of a recessionary environment. Now, I don't challenge this. I think that the debt burden has to be reduced, but I think it has to be seen in a larger context of what the country needs are, and in the context of the SDGs. It can't be simply a question of financial balance. That is a narrow conception. So I'm saying that the policy discourse has largely been this narrow framework of fiscal discipline. And I see this also in the academy, not just in terms of the IMF World Bank thing, whether it's through the World Bank's Caribbean Business Forum, where they're trying to improve the business environment. No one could deny the importance of improving the business environment. I think those things are important, but I will go on to show that there are fundamental challenges here that go beyond those. I think that perhaps an interlude could be seen in the work of Worrell. I think Worrell has taken on this problem in a much broader level. But I still think that his position ends up being not sufficiently comprehensive, and that I think that much of his analysis, I would say, mirrors the Barbados circumstances. I couldn't see, for example, Jamaica with a fixed exchange rate, and they're actually going the other way. But this is not the place to debate that. But what I'm saying, his work and the work of Vanus James, I think, is very much different. And it's a great pity that our young scholars aren't reading more of these people's work. So there are other publications. For example, the IDB did some work on institutions. But I think the failure there again is that they see institutions as, they don't see institutions as arising out of social processes, but they see institutions as a kind of endpoint. But still very useful work that goes beyond economic fundamentals. I think that the fundamental challenge of these publications, they fail to recognize that the world is now in what I call the fourth industrial revolution. And the Caribbean has to go through, or needs to go through intense structural change characterized by the increasing role of knowledge and the investment in the production, export of capital services. And I want to spend a little time on this. I'm arguing that the world has changed and the current structures and the current activities are not going to deliver the kinds of growth that we want unless we begin to invest in what I call the capital goods sector. And what I mean is that we cannot write the capital goods sector as Solo does. Solo could write the capital goods sector that way because they produce capital. We have what I call a domestic capital sector, which must be distinguished from intermediate imports. And by domestic capital, I mean those areas of capital which are developed in the domestic sociology. So to give an example, the Pan Men of Trinidad and Tobago, when they go abroad, what they carry is domestic capital, and they're deploying that capital service. And there, to me, is where there's a lot of failure in the academic sense in modeling the Caribbean properly. So capital has to be properly disaggregated to recognize the critical role of domestic capital and its marginal product. And as we model this sector, we'll then identify firms and activities that have two basic characteristics. Firms that save foreign exchange and firms that make foreign exchange, which is a binding constraint apart from labor productivity in Caribbean. So I put that table as I put it on the table as a critical point. Let me move on to some other areas where I think there's been policy focus. There's been a return to development planning, and a number of countries have had long-term plans. These have been embedded with the UN SDGs. And why this is important is that they tend to emphasize that historically disenfranchised group of persons in our society, including women and youth, and the disabled and so on. And these plans at least attempt to promote these groups. The problem with many of these plans is that they are not bipartisan, and so one is not sure whether a change of government will see the change of the plan. That's the first thing. The exception has been Jamaica. They also are not accompanied by a financial plan, so you get a sense of what could be financed, what can't be financed in these difficult in this time of fiscal stress. And many of these plans talk about green economies, and they talk about green sectors to be built, and they talk about energy, and in many cases, they fix targets for energy development. And this is a positive sign. But I think the problem, though, is that the idea of green is often too narrowly defined in environmental terms, in a kind of UNEP framework. I think green for small states must be any activity that does not create challenges for the economy. So that I would argue that exports of education service is a green activity. Exports of health services is a green activity. And those are activities within the domestic capital sector, by the way. So, and I think a good example of this emphasis of green on the in the narrow sense of environmental is the work by the CDB on transitioning to a green economy, where it is wholly focused on green in terms of the environment. Now, I would argue that a grave policy misstep is to imagine that the Caribbean can ride out the current crisis without serious structural change, and that the proper management, so if we had proper management through better institutions, that will be the answer. For some, it is a return of vibrant oil prices. We're just waiting for oil prices to pick up. And others, the improvement of tourism receipts. If we could get more tourists, we'll solve these problems. Either way, under the most optimistic scenarios, it is not likely that sustainable growth can occur under the current configuration of sectors and activities. This is a fundamental point I'm raising. The argument here is not to abandon existing economic activities, but that the government must open the envelope for more entrepreneurial talent. This goes beyond the World Bank's doing business by incentivizing a broader range of activities to include those historically dispossessed groups, women and youth in particular. So I argue that what we have to do is to move beyond this complex of activities and sectors to what is now regarded as a knowledge economy. And so my argument is that there are 4 fundamental pillars to achieving this, and they're quite achievable. The first is we have to return to an industrial policy to identify additional and complementary activities where there are positive spillovers. So the point that Stiglitz makes is governments must pursue those activities for which there are positive spillovers. And modern industrial policy goes beyond the old style approach. We're talking about competitive policies, trade and inward FDI policies, policies to foster innovation, and I'll come back to that. For example, we also have to conceive of sectors differently. For a long time, we think of tourism services only by counting the number of tourists that arrive in our particular jurisdiction. That's a mistake. Tourist services must also include all those persons who work on cruise ships and who are taking their tourism services outside of our national borders. And in a sense, what we have to do is to encourage our firms to go outwards. There's no reason why the domestic firm has to be fighting up in a small space, so that you must look at ways in which you incentivize firms to move out of the domestic economy. And the evidence is that Caribbean firms, relative to other SIDS, are fewer in terms of their export interests. And so I argue that while governments are challenged by inefficiency, and it is well known, I want to leave you with this point which Stiglitz made. He says limitations on the capacity of government should affect the choice of instruments for carrying out industrial policy, but not whether they should undertake industrial policy at all. It's not the issue of whether the government has a role. Governments in these small economies have an important role because they are the employers of last resort. That has been the cultural evolution of these spaces. We have to understand this. The government can't throw up its hand and say it's the private sector. It has to act. But let us force them to act sensibly. And I would add to this business of industrial policy the idea of what I call communication, interconnection. And I'm talking about interconnection at all levels. So that Trinidad and Tobago, for example, as a twin island state, interconnection should be such that someone in Tobago should not need to come to Trinidad for government service. And where there are more islands and so on, this should be the case. So e-governance is a critical aspect of this. So, and this interconnection must not just be national, it must be regional. And there are opportunities to do this. But I think that multi-island states would benefit. The second pillar, I argue, is diversification of markets and activities by encouraging, as I say, a broader range of entrepreneurs. And among the things I would say is the development of inclusive credit institutions, creating institutions to provide credits for innovation and the capital producing sector, including, as I argue, education and health for exports. For a long time, education and health has been seen as domestic activities. There is no need for this. There's no reason why it should be so. So that the labor market in the Caribbean should not be seen only in terms of the domestic space. The labor market is a global market if we train our young people to provide global services. So the universities should be training our young people in the provision of global services. It means then it doesn't matter where they are in the world, those services could be provided. This is a different kind of logic, in which case the unemployment rate of 40% about young people is absolutely unnecessary. Thirdly, I argue that the role of regional integration is absolute important, and I take McIntyre's point. But I think for another reason, the world is now dominated by global value chains. And regional and global value chains are critical if we're going to be competitive in the modern world. The idea of the single form, which we were taught in Economics 101, is a dying product. So there has to be a new mindset. And this must be complemented, I want to make this point clear, by free movement of Caribbean people. There is this foolish idea that if you open the market of Trinidad or Jamaica, all the Guyanese will come here. This is a nonsense. There is no evidence for it. You need people to move freely. The middle classes could move freely. But you want the ordinary citizen to move freely. When the ordinary citizens move freely, the Guyanese know what Jamaica beer is. Jamaica know what they continue to consume each other products. So you have an immediate rise in demand. You don't need for Carry Fest every 2 years because we know each other's culture. We go to each other's festival. That is something which we have to emphasize. Free movement of people, not just free movement of goods. Of course, there must be constraints and people must move. And if they move under conditions which they violate their immigration requirements, then that's another story. But what you want is the free movement to encourage talent. The people who move are usually the very talented people. And so, for example, I think that the Citizens by Investment program, which has been touted as a new FDI in the Caribbean, That could be an opportunity to encourage global talent to the Caribbean, whether in science, whether in technology, whether in business. If it is shaped properly, small economies need talent, and we must find it anywhere we can. Among our own people, in other places, it doesn't matter. Talent is talent. And I would say the fourth area is we have to build technical capacity. In the 1980s, the IMF told us you don't need to build technical capacity. All you need to do is to get it off the shelf. We now know that technical capacity is important for two reasons. One, is allow you to innovate, and secondly, it allows you to make proper technology choice. And given and innovation is also, technical capacity is also important, because the oceans, for example, are an opportunity for exploitation sustainably. But we have to have the technical capacity to do it. So you have to build that capacity. And in the 1980s, we destroy a lot of our technical capacity in sugar and so on the assumption that these were not profit-making. The evidence now is that even in the North Atlantic, the state is in the forefront of building skills and developing technologies, general technologies. But given the small size of Caribbean economies, I think that this technical capacity has to be built on a regional basis, and it makes sense. And more particularly, the cost of technical investment in technical capacity is high. And so joint arrangements with the public and private sector is very important to be able to commercialize. Cuba, despite all its problems, has an enormous enormous pharmaceutical industry. It's doing extremely well. And you look at Costa Rica, which has a lower GDP than Trinidad and Tobago, and invests more in technical capacity. And you see the quality of the goods they export is much higher. So these are serious matters to discuss. And I want to say something. Last point I want to make is this business of emigration. I think it's a misunderstanding. We have an old notion of Caribbean people going into North America as part of some great adventure. That is nonsense. Caribbean people live in multiple spaces. Remittances are just one example of the flow. People correspond daily. People move between these countries daily. It's a complex relationship. When North America becomes difficult, some come home, some go abroad. Large numbers of scientists that have left the Caribbean have gone to North America as a result of family reunification. So Caribbean people live in multiple spaces. So the question is, we must not block our young people from going abroad. This business of a brain drain is a misnomer. We don't have a brain drain. We have people located in different places. What we have to do is to engage them, so that somebody in North America should be able to come to the Caribbean for 6 months and deploy their skills, and vice versa. If you rethink these things, then what you see is that there are benefits. Clearly, if 100 teachers leave us, 100 school teachers leave a school one semester, it's a problem. But the point is that every small economy in the world is characterized by high levels of immigration. This is a fact, emigration. So the issue is not emigration. The issue is how you engage our people wherever they are. And I want to stop there by saying that these 4 pillars will allow us, will edge us towards what I call a knowledge-based economy, which is where the world is going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen, for another interesting and important presentation on, he's beginning to address the matters of what policy changes are required to address some of the issues that have arisen over the last several years. I did hear in there a difference of opinion between what he said and what Dr. McIntyre said earlier about emigration, and therein lies a core or a seed for some discussion, perhaps even controversy, to stir up the pot, and that is good. That is very good. So we look forward to that debate as things progress. We come to the fourth presenter now. Topic: the centrality of the private sector in the development process. Mr. Peter Gantoum, Deputy Chairman, Guardian Group, Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. He has had a distinguished career in finance, accounting, and auditing since qualifying in June 1969 as a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. He was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Guardian Holdings Limited in July 1999 and served the company in that capacity until 2009. Mr. Gantoum is a former senior partner of Price Waterhouse, latterly Price Waterhouse Coopers, and has presented numerous papers on technical accounting and finance-related subjects. He has also served as chairman of the Accounting Standards Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Trinidad and Tobago, and as a member of the board of directors of the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago. He has also been appointed by the Trinidad and Tobago government to serve on a number of fiscal review committees. Mr. Gantoum is currently the Deputy Chairman of Guardian Holdings Limited and Chairman of Guardian Life of the Caribbean Limited. So he will now bring the industry perspective in the discussion. We welcome Mr. Gantoum.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am here as your sacrificial layman, surrounded as I am by academia. And I also have been selected by Dr. Dukaran to face the quick bowling immediately prior to the luncheon interval. So bear with me, please. I will settle scores with Dr. Dukaran in due course. I am honored to have the opportunity to address the topic of today's event, and specifically to offer my views on the centrality of the private sector in the development process. I will seek to illustrate, by way of two anecdotes, how the drift away from recognition of this very element of the development process, i.e., the central role of and the disciplines and best practices proven within the private sector, has contributed to economic and social malaise. I propose to draw upon my experiences in the private sector, first as a chartered accountant, as you heard, in practice for close to 30 years, and then as a CEO and more latterly deputy chairman of a publicly owned and listed financial services group. I regret to say that I haven't yet fully extricated myself from the second career. I will also, in conclusion, make a small number of recommendations as to how this trend might be reversed. And in support of these, I will describe briefly one, what I believe to be persuasive recent case that demonstrates successful public and private sector cooperation. Before proceeding, I want to state that despite the fact that I have, over my years, had not inconsiderable experience in working throughout the CARICOM region, and indeed in parts of Central America, the comments that I am going to make are derived principally from the Trinidad and Tobago experience, the Trinidad and Tobago situation. I hope and suspect, however, that there is some applicability in what I state to the wider CARICOM circumstances. Let me start anecdote number one, and this I wish to emphasize at the outset, is entirely apolitical. In 1986, a new government took power in Trinidad and Tobago, following a period of boom and then near bust, both consequences of global hydrocarbon price movements, and hence largely uninfluenced by domestic policy interventions. One initiative taken by the new administration was to examine the efficiency of the prevailing fiscal apparatus, I use that word in the widest sense, and to introduce reform for both budgetary and economic stimulation purposes. One feature of this top-down analysis was the establishment of a multi-sectoral fiscal performance committee, the objectives of which are obvious from the name, and which reported to the Ministry of Finance. I was fortunate to be a member of this committee. It was a great learning experience. The work of the committee, supported as it was by an able secretariat, was guided by an agreed reliance upon data from local and international sources to the greatest possible extent. Comparative analysis was the foundation of the committee's work and revealed, as we suspected, numerous shortcomings and inefficiencies in existing revenue law and incentive provisions. One notable output of the work of the committee was the recommendation to adopt value-added tax as a replacement for numerous costly, hidden, and cascading indirect taxes. When the decision was taken by the government to move in this direction, the private sector funded the engagement of a VAT expert from England to advise on administrative and technical aspects of the proposed legislation. It was a cooperative effort, and I emphasize, guided by rigorous analysis of cost versus benefit, risk versus reward in the fashion of the private sector. The VAT Act was proclaimed in 1989 and came into effect on the 1st of January, 1990. Naturally, as in all new systems, certain glitches, mostly minor in my view, were encountered. But the broad embrace of and compliance with VAT, brand new taxing system, was remarkably successful. This was in 1990. I will say that not many years thereafter, Jamaica followed a similar path, and what is called the goods and services tax, but it is a value-added tax, was introduced with not dissimilar results. I will return to this in my concluding remarks. Experience number one of the salutary outcomes from hard, data-driven analytical work. More recently, anecdote number two, drawn from my experience in Guardian Life insurance company, as its name suggests. But I suspect that most similar institutions in Trinidad and Tobago, I can't speak for outside, have faced not dissimilar, as you will hear, frustrations. In September 2018, exactly 2 years ago, specifications for an individual annuity product were submitted to the Central Bank and to the Board of Inland Revenue for respective approval. The Central Bank provided, very expeditiously, some 3 months, their conditional approval. The condition was the assent of the BIR, the Board of Inland Revenue. For this type of policy, insurance policy, that's perfectly understandable. Correspondence has been exchanged monthly since November 2018 and the present time. Invariably, the responses from the BIR, when we received them, resulted from our earnest entreaties. Neither our time today nor your patience will permit me to recite the long saga of petty inquiries, kicking the can, as we say, into the tall grass, etc. But today, the policy remains unapproved. And who has suffered as a result? Yes, Guardian shareholders, for sure, as this will be a profitable addition to the suite of products offered. But much more so, in my opinion, are hundreds, possibly thousands, of investors and savers for their retirement who are deprived of access to an improved and better priced pension vehicle. This second anecdote illustrates just how frustrating is the trend, visible in everyday life to all of us, towards business being made as difficult as possible. I do not believe for a moment that ministers of government and the state technocracy generally have set out to put up roadblocks to doing business. But rather, I hold the view that this is the result of an attitude of suspicion and mistrust of private sector motives that has gradually been allowed to grow throughout significantly all areas of the public service. Chairman of ANSA Macau, for the non-Trinidadians here, one of the major conglomerates, listed public company here in Trinidad and Tobago, Chairman Mr. Norman Sabga put it thus in a recent address, June this year, to the AmCham, American Chamber of T&T, and I quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, Trinidad and Tobago faces several social and structural constraints along the journey to becoming a competitive and diversified economy. As citizens and business leaders, we experience these challenges every day. There is almost an ideological resistance to linking productivity to reward, discipline to excellence, efficiency to competitiveness, and delivering world-class service to sustainability." End of quote. I totally agree, and certainly couldn't have put it any better. And sticking to my commitment to comparative analysis, data, let us look at the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Global Report. It presents a dismal picture. Out of 190 countries, the overall rankings score as follows: Trinidad and Tobago, 105. Barbados, 129. Grenada, 147. St. Lucia, 93. And a somewhat brighter spot, Jamaica, 75. I'll come back to Jamaica. For registering property and paying taxes, Trinidad and Tobago scores 158 and 166th, respectively, out of 190. This is amazing. This is a country awash in oil dollars for half a century, and with access to all the administrative and technological expertise of OECD countries. This is the country of which we boast, with justification, the entrepreneurial spirit that creates 100-player steel orchestras and 3,000-person stage presentations. Yet this country, this same country, presents less of business facilitation than of business obstructionism. I turn now to the conclusions that can be drawn from the above real-life situations and the many others that doubtless have been faced by those present. In planning any enterprise, in committing resources to any initiative, objective data accompanied by careful analysis are essential. Absent these, one is adopting a policy or introducing a measure by what we call VAPs. Good intention is no substitute for clinical, fact-based evaluation. In the area of tax incentives, a subject dear to me, we observe all too frequently well-intentioned tinkering with irrelevant revenue laws. A case in point is the introduction via the Venture Capital Act 1994, Trinidad and Tobago Venture Capital Act. This was subsequently amended in 1997, 1999, and again in 2005. Minor amendments. This act introduced incentives to support business startups and entrepreneurship more generally. Absolutely noble objective. I have no evidence to claim that these were formulated, these acts and the subsequent amendments, without consideration of the quantitative outcomes expected, both on the tax foregone side of the equation and on the economic benefits to accrue thereafter. What is indisputable is that the objectives were not served. A minimal number of businesses benefited from this form, or from the form of private equity, beg your pardon, and an equally dismal number of institutions or high net worth individuals were motivated to play the part of business angels. Yet to date, again, 1994, a quarter of a century, nothing has changed. No empirical study of what led to failure or what amendments, legal or administrative, would offer a greater opportunity of success. The act languishes in the law libraries. And we bemoan the absence of business entrepreneurialism. I believe the private sector's proven approach to decision-making is exemplary. Identify your goal, establish the strategies to be adopted, meticulously plan the initiatives, the tactics to be taken in support of the strategies. Classic top-down thinking, all based on hard data and rigorous research. I cannot leave this subject without a quick word on the availability, or the lack thereof, of national statistics. These are abysmally outdated and more than a little suspect where they exist. Among others, the eminent economist, attorney, and thinker Dr. Terry Farrell has bemoaned unavailingly the underperformance of our Central Statistical Office. Moody's last report, dated July 2019, says as follows, pardon the long quote, but I think it is instructive. Trinidad and Tobago's macroeconomic institutional capacity, including fiscal and monetary policy frameworks, are weaker than the median of B(a) rated peers. The absence of key macroeconomic data and the low quality of the statistical information are important shortcomings. GDP by expenditure, for instance, is a notable data input which has not been published or updated since 2009. This is a report dated 2019. I won't continue, but it goes on in that vein. Enough said on that point. We live in an interconnected world. We've had that emphasized over and over again this morning, and rightly so. Choices abound for our next takeaway dinner, for the jurisdiction in which we plan to invest. It is all about competition, identifying and playing to one's advantages. At a national level, ease of doing business can be made a clearly lucrative strategy. I posit here, ladies and gentlemen, we are failing dismally in this regard. So, by way of conclusion, it is unhelpful merely to point out things that we would like to see change and that we or someone must effect change. Let me offer a few possible steps forward. I can offer no prescription to cure deeply entrenched prejudices, not all held by government and the trade union movement, I wish to add. What follows stem from my reflections on the subject before us and the research I did to prepare this paper. These are suggestions aimed at the private sector in the hope that it will regain the center stage in the debate on national development. I looked around for an example of policy formulation and implementation that have conduced to development success. The recent turnaround in Jamaica's fortunes struck me between the eyes. An impressive reversal of economic decline has been achieved. My inquiries revealed that the private sector has been hugely influential in this process. And this influence, I learned, results in large measure from the weight given to the positions advanced by the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, PSOJ. Again, I will forego detail in the interest of staying within the allotted time. But I am convinced that this Jamaica model of a united private sector voice, possessed by an organization that has worked hard in its relatively short life, the PSOJ is less than 40 years old, worked diligently to gain access to and earn the respect of successive governments, is one of the hallmarks of the Jamaican recent story and one that merits careful consideration by Trinidad and Tobago's numerous chambers and associations. Manufacturers, energy industry players, tourism-based industries naturally have special interests. But I suggest in challenging times, or even in less challenging ones, these interests may well need to be subordinated to the real big issues. Successful corporations do not operate with a subsidiary or division X in conflict with positions adopted by division Y. Take an extreme situation, one arguing for tariff protection and another shouting loudly in support of free trade. That's just untenable. It can't work. In similar vein, I propose the message of the private sector should be articulated by a single voice, clearly, objectively, and frequently. I come to my second and final recommendation. The private sector, through whichever organ presents its positions, should exercise the very same strategic process to which I referred earlier. We must identify the major generic impediments to development. I think the work has been done for us in large measure today. For example, infrastructure, forex policy, public sector reform, and build positions analytically and meticulously on the strategic initiatives that will achieve positive change. To reestablish its position under the spotlights, the private sector must argue rationally and fact-supported for, say, very topical industrial relations reform and the genuine reward for productivity and efficiency. This approach, I contend, will demonstrate that positive outcomes will secure everyone's interests, the national good, and that indeed the private sector is indispensable to the development process. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cantoon. The industry perspective is indeed an important one, and the lessons learned he has presented here this morning should serve as useful input into the discussion and the debate about how to resolve many of the issues identified here today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at that point where we could have some discussion and entertain some questions. I think there's a microphone on each table, so I will just try to moderate the session, and I invite you to any questions you may have. Yes? Sure.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. First, let me start by thanking the Institute of International Relations for the kind invitation for me to participate. As the head of the biggest regional institution in the region, the Association of Caribbean States, I am very pleased to hear some of the discussion that has taken place among the panelists today. And I do have some comments, questions, and recommendations. Sure. Of course, some of these things are rhetorical. Nobody has to answer them, but I thought I would throw them out. And it's very good that the Institute has taken this opportunity to honor Sir Alister with an intellectualization on regionalism, something that we have not had for a very long time, because we have spent time picking regionalism apart and putting it into small constituencies that make no sense. And so I'm very glad that the panelists are able to share their perspective, not only on regionalism, but also on multilateralism. Here is an organization that was created by CARICOM. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. And this organization, as we heard from both the featured speaker and from Dr. Dukaran, was created with the vision of ensuring convergence between CARICOM countries and Latin America. But we still sit 25 years later talking about these things without understanding that we have started to implement these things. And we take no credit for the things that we have done. And both Sir Alister and Sir Sridhar were at the heart of Time for Action and ensured that we now have an organization that has 25 member states around the Caribbean Sea, that we have an organization that has further integrated non-independent countries into its decision-making. So we have 10 associates. And we have an organization that has grown to the point where we have 28 observers. Observers on every continent except for Australia. Yet we are still talking about how we are going to do these things when we have examples of how we are doing it and not getting credit for it. I am not looking to put the ACS or any regional organization at the forefront today. But what I want to know is, how do national governments take into consideration regionalism when they talk about things like GDP, for example, when GDP is done at a national level? When we talk about SDGs, which are done at a national level. When we talk about the private sector, which is still not a regional private sector. How are we putting regionalism forward as a model for development if nationalism continues to be the yardstick? and not regionalism. So regional organizations, whether it's the CDB, whether it's CARICOM, whether it's ECLAC, whether it's ACS, are not integrated into the discourse. So at some point, somebody will remember, oh, we have a regional organization that can help us with regard to Latin America. But we have Latin America sitting at our table already. So how are we utilizing the things that we have? The other point I want to make has to do with comparative analysis and the fact that some of the things that we are speaking about, we pretend does not happen already in the region. We have a small group called the OECS, where a lot of these things are already taking place, whether it is the freedom of movement that we are so lacking in the rest of the region. And so the OECS finds itself isolated and not supported by the bigger countries, of course, until there is a disaster. And the other thing we need to speak about, and these are questions in statement forms, is the issue of the political environment in the region at this time and the impact that it will have on us. Let me give you a very good example. In 2017, when we had the hurricanes that affected Barbuda, the BVI, Dominica, and so on, Irma and Maria, at the heart of the recovery effort and the humanitarian effort was Venezuela. Many people don't know that because Venezuela has not blown its own horn. But Venezuela moved these climate refugees from Barbuda to Antigua. St. Lucia was used as the hub for moving most of the food and humanitarian supplies to these countries using Venezuelan helicopters, etc. What has happened now with the Bahamas, where we have this huge humanitarian crisis? The ACS cannot mobilize people from Venezuela anymore because the Bahamas is too close to the United States. How in the region, how are we going to come together on these things, even with regard to humanitarian things? The other thing, which is very clear to me, is that we have had mainly gentlemen speaking about the issues. So I was very happy to hear Dylan speak to the issue of inequality. You have to treat with women differently in these debates. You must have in this comparative analysis something to do with how gender is affected and how gender responds to development. And so these are some of the things that I have to say, except to agree with the last speaker with the issue of Jamaica. Yes. We need to study Jamaica. Jamaica is the case where the private sector and the government has come together with regard to PPPs, as opposed to Trinidad, which is at the other end of the chain, where you do not see the PPP power that you should be seeing. And Jamaica has been able to attract, because of that preparedness, investment. And not just investment from Jamaica, but global investors. And which is the other question, how do we deal with the global private sector in our region?
Maybe we could have some of the panelists comment on the many issues you have raised there. Thank you.
I'm leaving this afternoon, that's
yes,
why.
I hear you. No problem. Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a couple of quick things. First and foremost, on the issue of fiscal consolidation, fiscal adjustment. 15 years ago, it was a matter of what is the appropriate balance. Today, that is no longer the issue. The whole post-global analytical work, Olivier Blanchard and others, looking at fiscal multipliers, what are the growth impacts? The impact of fiscal adjustment on inequality, the impact of fiscal adjustment on social protections, and so on. The whole question of whether it's revenue-based or expenditure-based consolidation has thrown up a lot of granularity in how you constitute a fiscal consolidation program to ensure that you protect vulnerable groups, that you protect priority sectors, and so on. It's not a science, it's an art, so there will be mistakes, but it's no longer strictly a matter of financial balances. The second thing is this question of diversification. Myself and two young Chinese economists did a lot of work on this and the question of small states. And we concluded that diversification as a strategy, even within small states, is heterogeneous. A country like St. Kitts, or my own country, Grenada, cannot diversify into many things. But you can do what you do more efficiently. You can become a more efficient tourism producer, and you could offer different types of tourism. So you can have a main product and diversify around that. A country like Trinidad and Tobago, which has an energy base, a larger population, a larger labor force, diversification can mean something more broader in scope than it would in some of these mini states. What we also found out was that countries that had diversified, small states in the last 30 years, with a few exceptions, Mauritius being one, Malta being another, did not experience stronger rates of growth, but what they did experience was less economic volatility. So in that sense, it strengthened resilience. On the issue of emigration, I have to say I'm a little lost here. When you look at, and as we all agree, the issue of economic data and statistics is a problem. Policy making is happening too much in a vacuum of hard numbers, although numbers should not always guide you totally. When you look at Caribbean immigration over the last 25 years, as we have done, and what information is available, it's largely been immigration to North America. In fact, for some countries, with the United Kingdom, you have reverse migration. You have more people coming back than you have people going to the United Kingdom, but not for all countries. When you look at what the CARICOM Secretariat offers in terms of information on inter-regional flows, CARICOM skill certificates, very small numbers of people are moving, mainly because the bureaucratic process is tedious. It takes long to get the CARICOM certificate. Outcomes are uncertain. People taking 9 months, almost a year, to get a CARICOM skill certificate. When you look at the Caribbean populations in the diaspora, United States, Canada, UK, there's not a lot of movement back or across. People go there and they find something to do, and as we say, at fairly high levels. The development of the diaspora into Caribbean development is a separate issue. That is a very well-placed issue. But Caribbean people are largely going to North America. They're largely skilled. The issue is the trajectory is getting higher, steeper. More people are going, largely because we're not providing economic opportunities for young people. Youth unemployment is high, even among skilled labor, and moving within the region is also difficult. And the point that Dr. Soma makes is very true. We have to move on several planks. One is the short and the medium term, which is stabilization. The cost of high, elevated levels of debt is that you consume a lot of your government revenues in supporting debt, and the strategic investments we need to make, we're not making. Because we have adjusted largely by cutting capital expenditure, we now have much weaker infrastructures than we had 15 years or 20 years ago. A lot of our education system needs modernization. I read often in the press of the university here the severe financial pressures it is facing. So our educational institutions need additional resources. Our infrastructure needs work. And how do you do that? When you have a much better fiscal situation. But that's not the only plank. There are other planks we have to go on. And one of the planks we have to go on, we have to widen our economic relationships. These may not bring immediate benefits in terms of exports and in terms of investment, but we have to diversify our relations, expose our business community to, this is the key role, important role of the state, providing direction to where we go, putting modalities in place to bring business people from one part of another to another part. Chair, I leave you with one thing. I have a very good colleague who's no longer with the fund now. He's one of the advisors to the Indian government. And he did a lot of work in Mauritius. And one of the things that he always brought home to me when we used to look at these matters 10 years ago about trade policy and so on, and he said to me, Arnold, one of the most important ingredients of an effective trade policy for a small country is not tariff adjustments, it's investment promotion. You have to have a strong institutional arrangement to go out into the world and find business opportunities for your country. You have to get the right people doing that. And you have to put strategic, you You have to facilitate strategic relationships between your business people and business people where you find them. And he said in Mauritius, they have done that very, very well.
Thank you for your comments. I don't know if any of the other panelists wish to comment on what was said. Okay. We go back to the floor. Professor Bowen. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, sure.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me congratulate the panel on very stimulating presentations.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
I have a few comments. One, let me start with the question of crime, which Arnold mentions in his presentation. And just to say that I agree that the incidence of crime is costly, and we need to reduce it. But I also want to say there's another reason why we need to approach this issue of crime reduction in maybe a more comprehensive fashion than is current. And that is the dual of crime, or a consequence of crime, is in fact the loss of labor. When you incarcerate a high percentage of your youth, you are in fact removing a significant source for economic growth. And I think we don't look at that side of it. And so that even when we deal with questions of crime detection, crime prevention, but even when we deal with the question of judicial administration, we ignore the fact that we lock away a lot of people, some of whom might be innocent, for very long periods of time in remand, which is also a human rights abuse. I'm not arguing for a human rights perspective here. All I'm saying is when we take it, let us take it a little more holistically and consider that there is also the hidden cost of loss of labor and productivity when you incarcerate a lot of young people. Secondly, I'm very pleased with the work that you're doing on the employment effects, or the growth effects of simulation exercises. I would like to think it would be useful as well to take it one step further and to simulate the employment effects of the growth that you might achieve. I think this would be very meaningful. I remember when I did the study on Caribbean development in the year 2000, making the point, having looked at the demographics of the region, that in order to generate an acceptable level of employment or unemployment, then what the countries needed to grow, sustain economic growth rates, fairly substantial proportions. So I think that if you take your analysis one step further, you will be helping us in trying to see how we might actually address the unemployment problem. Now, Professor Dukuran raises the question of, among many other interesting things, the question of the nexus between inequality and economic growth. And I think he's right. I think we need to talk about the new nexus. In doing so, we might usefully remember that the reduction of inequality promotes economic growth, that there's a positive growth effect from reductions in inequality. This has been demonstrated in a number of studies. We should also recognize that if you reduce inequality, then the chances are that you will improve the quality of housing, you will improve the question of where people live, and that you might, by so doing, improve disaster resilience. So there's a connection there as well. Next point I want to make is a broader one. I think we need to distinguish between policy failure due to poor design and policy failure due to poor implementation. Lots of times the policies fail because they're implemented so badly. Similarly, the problem of public expenditure is not exclusively an issue of appropriate levels or over-expenditure, but also an issue of not getting value for money. Which is to say that if there is efficiency in the level of expenditure, then we can support the outcomes. That the level of expenditure might not seem wasted if, in fact, there is the positive outcome through efficiency measures.
Could we allow a response here, Prof, or you want to
No,
continue?
I'm almost finished.
Yes,
Just
sure.
a couple
Okay.
of two more points.
Sure, okay.
Well, one more, I think I'll stop it. And it's on the immigration issue, which Dylan raises. It is okay to talk in terms of Caribbean people living in multiple spaces. We know that. The real issue from a developmental point of view is how to and to what extent does the Caribbean capture the benefits of its investment in human capital? That is the key issue.
Yes. Thank you, Prof. Bond. Any comments from the panel?
I just want to say Compton's last point really hits the nail on the head. Small states will always have high levels of immigration. No? And he makes the very valid point about what is the level of economic growth or range of growth range that we need to sustain the labor force that we are, and skilled people that we are in fact producing. I think his number at the time was about 4 to 5%. We have tried to do some work on this, but the labor statistics are very, very, very bad. But I think we are coming out at around 4.5% as a growth rate, sustainable growth rate, to absorb the labor we are producing. But one of the issues too, it's not only persons that are getting a university degree, but it is the skill content of the labor, people with IT technology, capacity, and that kind of thing. And that means a lot of our institutions need modernization, or technical and vocational institutions and other institutions. And the other issue is, you quite rightly about the crime, this issue of the loss of the labor force. The Inter-American Development Bank has done a massive piece of work on crime, but published in 2017, a lot of it in Jamaica, including Trinidad and Tobago and Central America. If you can get access to it, it's voluminous, and you can go through it, even the exact, you will be astounded at the economic costs of crime. The private costs of security and so on that households and corporates have to absorb in this thing. And also, to come back to my colleague here about, this issue of policy making. Jamaica is cited as a good case. It is a good case. Grenada did a very good job of it as well with the IMF program. Barbados used to have a social partnership that functioned very efficiently at the time of their program in 1993, and going forward, I think it's went through some fits and starts. It looks to be coming back. But Danny Roderick spoke about that long ago when he talked about not long ago, when he wrote the book on institutions and growth. And he said we need institutions of consensus building. We need to set broad objectives for our societies. And one of the things that we can start in terms of the fiscal is to have medium-term fiscal targets. Governments and policymakers must be held accountable for targets. We should have a long-term anchor, whatever that is, where we are targeting. Debt to GDP ratios are common, but we can think about that. And what is the primary balance? What is the fiscal balance that we are targeting every year for ourselves to meet these? That includes savings for climate change effects, appropriate expenditures on education and health and so on. And then fiscal policies should be calibrated to achieve those targets. When people don't achieve the targets, they must explain why. One of the benefits I heard Amino Fraga, the former governor of the Bank of Brazil, Central Bank of Brazil, say a few years ago at the fund when they started inflation targeting in the Lula period was, he said, look, we did not expect inflation targeting some minimum range of inflation to solve our problems. But what it did was, it forced us to be accountable for policy. So we failed the targets for the first 18 months to 2 years, but we had to explain why we failed the targets. So that brings a transparency of policy to the business community. And then we had to say, well, what are the actions we are going to take to address this? So policy became more predictable and less uncertain. In the region, we still have one-year budgets. Most ministries of finance tell you that the government consults with ministries, they put together. We approach budgeting as a top-down thing. We decide what we are going to spend and then scratch our head how we're going to pay for it. What we need to first decide is what is the resource envelope that we have and how are we going to apportion the spending and where the trade-offs are. And then we have to be able to communicate that very clearly to the private sector and other actors in the economy, where we are going, and therefore the budget process cannot simply be a speech. It has to be a process of review and accountability that you have over periods of time. And that takes, Jamaica now they're talking about, and other countries they're talking about these fiscal commissions that you set up of independent people that have like the CBO, like in the United States, the Budget Office, and in the UK, you have these independent bodies that review fiscal policy. We can set up our own instrumentality, but it is important that we have a lot more accountability for policy, a lot more transparency in what we are trying to, where are we trying to go, and what are the targets we are trying to use to get there.
Thank you. All right, as we go forward, this gentleman, then Professor Byron, and then Mr. Allen online wishes to ask a question, and then we'll come to you too. Okay? And if we could try to keep it short, then we will get in all of you. Please, sir.
Hello, good day. Good afternoon. My name is Carol Naz. I'm with the Institute of International Relations. Thank you so much for your contributions. I'm going to speak a bit quicker. I'm going to try to be clear. I have a few questions. A few questions and two statements. The first question is, Mr. Adin actually spoke about the Caribbean. I think I heard him say the Caribbean has not done well compared even to other SIDS. I just wanted to know if you could explore that a bit more, compared to who? I would like to know. And also, he spoke about challenging the UNEP framework as it relates to the green economy, and spoke about exporting health services. That was a bit confusing because the green economy definition from UNEP is a triple bottom line. It's social inclusion, it's environmental sustainability, and economic viability, or commercial viability, if you want to call it that. So it has to satisfy all three. And the example of exporting health services, particularly if persons are taking long-haul flights to come and access those health services, is not exactly green. It's really carbon intensive. So that is not a really good idea if you're trying to call that a green economy service. But again, the point that I was trying to make there, or really what I'm probing, is this notion of green sectors or green activities and making them so general may not be helpful, because you don't know, it all depends on the nature of the business activity. The last thing I'll say is...
So you wish Mr. Collins to respond to that?
Yeah, Mr. Allen.
Mr. Allen, sorry.
Yes, and for the gentleman from Guardian Group, I think what okay, so just to give a bit of background, you mentioned Dr. Terence Farrell. So I spent years at the Economic Development Advisory Board writing advisory notes to our current Prime Minister, and it was chaired by Dr. Farrell. And what we found on a lot of the economic issues that we examined was that many of the inhibiting factors were not economic. So I think there's been a lack of mention about our culture and how that impedes business. In terms of particularly a lack of trust, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago. And the cost, I don't know how you would measure the cost of a lack of trust in Trinidad, but even within government, there's a lack of trust in terms of willingness to share data. So, I mean, willingness to share data from government to the private sector is an entirely different story. And even within the private sector, there's a lack of trust, which is why you have so many different bodies and associations, some of them that you mentioned. Everyone is existing to guard their own special interest. And so no one actually trusts that this other body will represent their needs and their interests well, which is why everyone is guarding their corner very, very vigilantly. So I don't know what you would prescribe to build trust, which I think is going to help to, I think it will definitely improve our business environment, because I can tell you as somebody who's been on the inside, when large businesses submit proposals to government, they usually look at, first they have to do the due diligence, but then they ask the question is, what are they trying to get from us? Are they trying to scam us? You know, are they trying to just make money off the backs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago? So I want to know, how would you really tackle some of the real cultural issues that make this region, I would say, a much more difficult place to do business than others?
Thank you. So before Mr. Gantoon comments, I think his name is Mr. Allen. I got it wrong just now. Is he online? Is he available to respond? The person down there at the computer desk? Yes, okay. So, can he do so now, please?
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
All right. There's a lot to say, but time.
Well, very short. The time is short, and there are a number of other questions about. So, if you could keep your response short, I'd appreciate it.
All right. On the issue of other SIDS, there's a definition of SIDS by the UN. And so we looked at those countries under the umbrella SIDS, and we look at their GDP performance. We're just comparing the GDP performance, growth performance of the Caribbean SIDS versus other SIDS. So that was the point there. I don't think it's necessary for us to get too entangled about what is green. I'm just saying that the emphasis in a number of documents has been on the environmental side, and they don't emphasize the social side. And I'm saying from the point of view of the Caribbean, green significantly must include health and education services, which have traditionally been domestic services. That's the point I'm making. If there are constraints, we could deal with those in terms of travel and so on, and the footprint. But I think that is a lesser issue. The issue is that there are two activities for which we have some capacity. So Barbados has done very well with fertility clinics, and other places that are doing it. You have the North Atlantic at our doorsteps with an aging population, and we could provide large amounts of health services at lower cost. And this is a missed opportunity, which is right at our doorsteps. So that's the point I was making. And if there are constraints, we could deal with those. Let me say one more thing on this business of immigration, because I think I've studied it and I've written quite a few papers on it under my old hat. Large numbers of young people in the Caribbean are providing apps for Google. That is not being recorded. If you go to Trinidad, large numbers of security personnel are Jamaicans. This is a fact. It has nothing to do with a skills certificate. Forget the skills certificate. People are moving. They move for 6 months, and after their immigration requirements are up, they go home, and then they come back. And I don't know what other sectors this is happening, but this is so well known now. But it's not reported. But the critical point I want to make is that if we do two things, if we have interconnection at all levels, including regional interconnection, you remove the barriers for young people to engage, then what will happen is that you create an education system that allows people to provide global services. So the youngster in Jamaica is not only considering work in New Kingston. That is just one option. He could produce services anywhere in the world. So I'm saying, and the significant point I want to make is the unemployment rate among young people of 44% in some countries, absolutely unnecessary. I am saying that if our school system churns out people with the kinds of skills and opportunities that is now possible with global interconnection, we could drive down that rate significantly in a generation. And I'm saying that if you talk to young people, many of them are doing that already. They source global inputs, they export globally. It's a totally different environment that is emerging. And I'm saying that we have to understand that environment and benefit from it. I wouldn't say anything else because...
Yes, thank you, Mr. Allen. And before Mr. Gantoon comments, Professor Byron wishes to address a question to him so he could take those two issues. Professor?
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, I thought all of the presentations were very stimulating and thought-provoking, and congratulations. Mr. Gantom, you represent private sector, and I think you know quite a bit about the financial services sector in particular. And I wanted to ask you about two things, three small things. The first thing is, in the crash of 2009 and so on, one of the things that emerged is that although the financial services sector has been an avenue for growth in the Caribbean and has also been one of the most rapidly regionalizing sectors, that there was a huge challenge of regulation of this sector. And I was wondering, to what extent has the private sector been collaborating with Caribbean governments in strengthening the regulatory framework? You know, how can Guardian or Sagicor or other companies strengthen my confidence in investing in this sector, in the region, unless I know that it is safe, unless I know that my pension is safe, and so on and so forth? I think that's a very important question, because this is a sector that is vital to resilience, to growth, and to really the security of our populations. Similarly, to what extent is the private sector engaged in dialogue and in collaboration with the governments in creating more avenues for health insurance, which is a critical issue across the region? And many, many people find that once they retire, they don't really have health insurance. And I think that the expertise in the private sector is needed to assist the governments with working out that challenge. And finally, property insurance. Property insurance in a region that is so disaster-ridden.
Perhaps you could have him comment then? Yes.
I'll try to link together, in answering your question, one or two other observations I have jotted. Let me say that I am not a representative of the private sector. Some of my colleagues there would probably lynch me for some of the things I say. But that I take as a compliment most of the time. With regard, let me take the easiest bit first. With regard to dialogue on that burning issue of health and health management, because as we all know, it's preventative, far more cost-effective than curative, eh? As we say, taking in. I would say from my perspective, there is, I will never say zero, minimal discussion, industry to governments or industry positions collectively over the CARICOM region developing. I think it's a very good point, but I'm making my jottings here. But to date, to my knowledge, it's been minimal. That's to the discredit as much of anything as to the industry. With regard to the regulation, yes, demanding and costly, and that is not going to reverse reality. That, in a certain extent, underlies and will continue to be an impetus for more accumulation, corporate mergers and acquisitions, because smaller players are just finding it impossibly burdensome to maintain. I won't get into the detail, but you need advanced technology now to keep up with reporting on PEPs, politically exposed persons, et cetera, et cetera. With regard to the harmonization of regulations, there is informal dialogue among regulators. And that, to a certain extent, has been, to my knowledge, again, I qualify it, pretty effective. However, in actually framing the legislation and the compliance structures that have been implemented, let's say the OECS has its own under the ECB, Jamaica, Trinidad, an awful lot of disunity exists at that very all-important, practical but all-important level. the ways that the actual regulations are drafted and applied, not terribly uniform. And it is something that you are totally correct. More and more the regional players have every good reason to try to influence. I mean, we, for example, Guardian, operate in the Dutch Caribbean. There's good dialogue, actually, between the governors of the central banks, respectively, of Aruba. Their political system is another complex issue in Curacao. You know some of this, I'm sure. And TT and J. And there's good dialogue, but the actual, again, I'm overstating the point perhaps, practicalities of the implementation and observing and achieving compliance, quite different.
Mr.
So there's a lot that could effectively be done.
Sorry to interrupt you. The gentleman who was there, he asked a question about trust. Are you able
I want to come back to that, but he's run away to lunch. Or is he still in the room?
Okay.
I just wanted to say one quick word which develops from what we're talking about, a broader subject. We talked a lot about the freedom of movement within CARICOM. I don't have a basis for voicing opinions on that. But let me say, again, particularly in services, I think it is less acute in trade, in tangibles, that there is an awful lot, an undesirable amount of bureaucracy and formalities associated with moving trade and with moving and introducing services. You know, in all the Brexit talk that is overwhelming us, we hear about frictionless trade, backstops and Irish lines of customs down the North Sea and all that. I tell you, to get an insurance policy that has been proven to be acceptable in TT or Jamaica for decades, and get that registered in, let's just call a place, in Kitts Nevis. I mean, that's another saga like I referred to earlier. And there isn't just commonly accepted that it has passed the hurdles of a qualified, mature central banking function, that it's passported into our neighboring territories. There is a lot of friction, and it's costly, of course it is. It is costly to have enough said on that. I think that this gentleman is absolutely right. I don't know I have a golden or silver bullet to answer it, but what I've tried to suggest is that the private sector, and as I say, I'm not at all embarrassed to say this, has got to pull itself away from what is seen as special interests. Equal short-termism in thinking that we like to blame governments on the annual budgetary cycle for exercising. Short-termism. And look, as all the standard textbooks on strategy tell us, at what are the real levers of change. And again, I say we've touched on those pretty well today. Most textbooks will tell you if you try to move more than 4 or 5 levers, you're nodding your head, you're going to get nowhere. And let us agree, we now wearing my private sector hat, and Mr. Farrier may want to shoot me, but that's his problem. I will duck his bullets. I can tell you, this is what has, in my view, not effectively been done. And that lifts the discourse then to moving the national good, not the manufacturing sector or the 1% sector, wherever they reside in people's minds, but we're showing national motives in way to deal with, and that naturally, that tide, to use that boring metaphor, will lift employment and social services, the tax stake collectively. So in maybe too many words, but I think that's the job of the private sector. Get out of their little pockets that you refer to and set core, limited number, strategic objectives that they can engage intellectually with the government about. I'll try to add my voice to that in the chambers if they give me a chance.
Thank you very much. I will take 2 more questions, Dr. Siratan, and I think the gentleman there from that table, and then we'll close for lunch. Please.
Yeah. Let me add my voice in congratulations to the panel this morning. I think it was very, very interesting as well. I want to be a little bit of devil's advocate just before lunch. And there was a question that seems to be, was in the room, but nobody seemed to have addressed it. And I want to ask the question of Mr. Gantoum and Arnold in particular. And this relates to the whole issue of the exchange rate and exchange rate policy in the management of our economy. So that's one. And I'm specifically asking Mr. Gantoum and the representative of the fund here. And there's many other questions I have, but we are
short on time.
To just ask one question that I had for Mr. Dukaran, and that was, you mentioned the whole issue of globalization, and you characterize globalization as a process that was in reversal, or alternatively as a process that had moved to a different stage. I just wanted to explain that distinction between reversal and a different stage, because a different stage could be a slightly slower pace of globalization, right? But you seem to be making a distinction between the reversal, which many people have argued that is in process now. But you seem to be making a very interesting point that globalization is not in retreat. It is just moving to a different transition. And one last question for Arnold, and is this whole issue of austerity, right? And you know, there are a lot of economists who says that austerity is an exercise in futility, because the objective you have for austerity, which is to reinvigorate growth, ultimately just is inconsistent with the modus operandi of austerity. So I want you to comment a little bit on that, because that is kind of part and parcel of the IMF's structure adjustment approach. Some aspects of it could be considered austerity. So I want you to comment on that.
Right. What I'd like then to do is ask Professor Dukaran to respond briefly to the question you asked him, and then in the interest of time, I'll invite the other question and then get the responses. Please, Professor Dukaran.
Well, I'm glad you referred the question of devaluation to my friend. I myself am looking forward to his answer, as well as Peter's answer. Very, very quick. There is the current populist view that globalization is in retreat. The other view that has emerged is that there is now a next chapter in globalization in which the entire process of globalization is changing, and that regionalization will become stronger in this new era as opposed to globalization. And that's why I made the point that regionalization might have a stronger impetus, and all the strategic shifts that are taking place in the global production sector is supporting that view, at least in accordance with the McKinsey Global Institute studies that I quoted from. But we can talk about that
later. Thank you.
Since I have this, I just want to say one small point. Dr. Suma raised the issue of the ACS as a platform. Wow. The ACS as a platform for convergence, and I just want to support her efforts in steadying the ACS and keeping it as a platform for the future.
Thank you. So we'll get the question from before we get any responses, sir.
Hello?
Last question.
Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Well, we'll try. Do your best.
I'll try to be quick. Arnold, I have two questions for you. I might have missed it as it relates to debt. I might have missed as it relates to the debt. But I think we might need to disaggregate the total debt stock as it relates to domestic and foreign, and treasury debt and central bank debt, meaning sterilization accounts. Otherwise, you might run the risk of overestimating the case. The second thing is on fiscal balance and your fiscal position. Of course, no one disagrees with that point. But as it relates to what Dylan says, I mean, with persistent external shocks, how do you really engage in fiscal sustainability? Today or this year, you might be fiscally sustainable, but you can have a collapse in external demand, and tomorrow morning, no fault of government policy, you're no longer fiscally sustainable. Yeah. The last comment I would make is as it relates to the nexus of inequality and growth. Yeah. Now, this is a point well taken, especially in advanced countries. But in our type of economies, where we have high import propensity, reducing inequality might most likely increase demand for imported goods and services, and we must consider the external constraint.
All right, so Dr. Allen, brief responses to the two gentlemen, as brief as you can. Thank you.
First of, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, on the issue of the exchange rate, when you look at the experience today, Trinidad runs a float of a kind. Guyana runs a float, Jamaica runs a flexible exchange rate, Jamaica runs a flexible exchange rate. Countries that rely a lot on commodity trade, flexible exchange rates are helpful because those shocks can be quite large. So it helps in the smoothing process. That's what the evidence would suggest, large and small. Dr. Nichols Shelton has done some work on this and shows it. Barbados and the OECS countries, particularly the ECCU countries, with their fixed exchange rates, that seems to have served them well. Where you have small labor markets, very small populations, not flexible labor markets, the ability of supply to respond to changes in demand and to changes in price competitiveness is not as strong. But we have spent a lot of time looking at the exchange rate as a policy tool. What the evidence seems to suggest is that whatever exchange rate regime you opt for, you need to have the structural reforms to underpin the exchange rate. You cannot compensate for inefficient domestic economic transactions by having a flexible exchange rate or a fixed exchange rate. You cannot compensate for low labor productivity. In fact, you can't sustain the exchange rate long term if you have low labor productivity. You cannot do that if you have fiscal indiscipline. We know that fiscal discipline as defined by well-set targets and containing expenditures within a certain envelope will underpin a strong exchange rate, whether it is flexible or it is fixed. So I would say what the lesson suggests is that we have done some fiscal restructuring, none of it sustained over a long period of time. If you think about Jamaica now, they have been going through adjustment for about 8 years. They have maintained a certain fiscal discipline over a period of time. That worked, but where we have been very weak in our policy is in structural reforms. We have not done enough to change the economic environment in which economic agents exist. Same on the question of austerity. The issue is my colleague talked about how you define debt. The simple definition is gross public sector debt. In the Caribbean, in Barbados, in Jamaica, it is the domestic debt that is very, very high. Delisle has all kinds of measures of this, net debt, this debt. At the end of the day, the debt is high, okay? And the debt servicing as a percentage of revenue is very high. Interest costs as a percentage of GDP, in Barbados in some places was 8-9% of GDP. That is by any standard very high. So I agree with you in terms of how you must be clear how you're defining debt. But on the question of the austerity, that comes to the issue which people are grappling with. If you front load the consolidation, how heavily front loaded should it be? Whether it should be more expenditure based than revenue based. In the region, we, through the granting of a whole battery of incentives, we are undermining our revenue mobilization effort by giving away 40% of statutory revenues every year, not only through Fiscal Incentives Act, but a whole range of discretionary incentives. So we can have a much stronger revenue mobilization effort than we have. On the expenditure side, as I've said already, the large state apparatus we have is inefficient, and for each country you have to work out what are your priorities and where do you think the state involvement can be, and do it as most cost efficient, value for money. Simply to say that austerity doesn't work does not solve the issue, because my friend, when your debt is 160-70% of GDP or sufficiently high, you cannot escape austerity. You cannot escape difficult periods of time. One of the reasons when we look at why our debt is so high, we have invested in a lot of, when you do the debt decompositions, you realize a lot of it is driven by state or government guaranteed debt, and we invested in a lot of large projects that have not necessarily improved the productive capacity of the countries. So I think those are the two, you were on austerity, and yes, you had, I think that's where...
thank you very much. I think we need to bring it to a close, and I want to thank Messrs. McIntyre, Dukaran, Allen and Gantum for some very stimulating presentations. Wish we had more time. We're inviting everyone to lunch, and the session reconvenes at 2:30 p.m. To be chaired by Professor Bowen. Thank you very much.